C-36. Ambush. The native creature closely matched the color of the cliff rock, camouflaging itself within a crevice. It had remained utterly motionless, blending seamlessly with the surroundings, and Luo Wen, focused on the greenery below, failed to notice the seemingly lifeless form was, in fact, alive. Luckily, Luo Wen's evolving eyes, with their now 30-meter range and heightened refresh rate, caught the creature's movement the instant it struck. The figure leaping toward him became vividly clear, a spider-like creature, gargantuan in size, several times larger than Luo Wen himself. Its body resembled a fortress, divided into two segments, the cephalothorax and a rounded, hair-covered abdomen. Its head bore 8 black, spherical eyes arranged in 3 rows, 4 small ones in front, 2 larger ones in the middle, and 2 more small ones at the back. At its mouth, a pair of chelicerae arched forward, exposing sharp, venomous fangs. It had 8 sturdy striding limbs, each jointed for exceptional mobility. Covered in hair and tipped with small claws and barbs, the legs spread wide, forming a deadly net as it leapt to envelop Luo Wen with its massive frame. Luo Wen had thought his own size made him a giant among insects, dominating worker ants in the desert. But this new environment wasted no time humbling him. The first creature he encountered dwarfed him completely. He had no interest in discovering what would happen if he was caught under the massive web-like trap. Nor was he keen on testing his carapace against those venomous fangs. To make matters worse, his current position on the cliff left him no room for agile maneuvers. Realizing the ground was close, Luo Wen decided to release his hooks and drop, hoping to both evade the attack and reach safety below. But the spider was faster. As Luo Wen detached from the cliff, one of its hairy limbs lashed out like lightning, snagging him mid-fall. Luo Wen reacted instantly, raising a sturdy burrower limb to shield himself. The spider's barbed limb bristled with backward-facing hooks, clinging tightly to Luo Wen's digging limb the moment they made contact. The spider, clearly experienced in handling prey attempting to escape via freefall, began reeling him back in. With horrifying efficiency, its venomous fangs advanced. Damn it! Luo Wen cursed, fear mingling with fury. He had underestimated the creature, whose unique adaptations made it a master predator. His attempt at escape had played right into its strengths. The hooked hairs, though seemingly delicate, were incredibly strong. Despite his frantic struggles, Luo Wen couldn't break free from their grip. The spider's fangs clamped down on his burrower limb. Though his carapace held for a brief moment, cracks soon formed under the pressure. Finally, the fangs punctured through to the soft muscle beneath, and a numbing sensation spread through Luo Wen's body. Damn it! Luo Wen cursed again, furious and alarmed. The creature's venom was potent, and the situation was quickly deteriorating. If this stalemate continued, his life would be forfeit. Desperation ignited his survival instincts. Luo Wen brought his powerful jaws to bear, biting through the joint of his trapped limb with all his strength. The moment he severed his digging limb, the spider reared back, and Luo Wen seized the chance to break free. With a coordinated push from his 6 remaining legs, he launched himself away using his newly evolved burst speed. In an instant, he was a blur of motion, a dark shadow leaping from the cliff crevice and tumbling to the ground below. The spider extended itself in pursuit, but despite its 8 eyes, it was clearly nearsighted. Luo Wen, now on the forest floor, was beyond its visual range. Frustrated, the spider retreating back into its crevice with the severed limb still clutched in its fangs. Moments later, the crevice was as silent and still as before. Luo Wen landed in a patch of undergrowth, hastily shoving aside grass to dig into the soil. With one limb missing, his digging speed had slowed, but he pressed on, seeking the safety of the earth. His wound continued to throb and numb, the venom melting away his muscle tissue. The severity of the toxin left Luo Wen both horrified and enraged. Damn it! That thing plays dirty, venomous and extremely venomous at that. Gritting his mandibles, he bit off the base of his severed limb to prevent the venom from spreading further. Scraping his jaws clean on the dirt, he muttered to himself. If the venom reached his mouth, he couldn't very well bite off his own head. After digging for what felt like hours, Luo Wen detected no other life nearby. Exhausted, he resorted to eating soil, a necessity he had never expected to face so soon. Although the taste was dreadful, it sustained him. He ate his fill before succumbing to sleep, his body beginning the long process of self-repair. Time passed. When Luo Wen finally awoke, he examined his body. He hadn't cocooned this time, but a new digging limb had grown in place of the old one. The new limb was significantly smaller than its counterpart, making Luo Wen look oddly mismatched with his uneven appendages. This is going to drive my OCD insane, he muttered, feeling a pang of frustration. Still, he was confident his genes would correct the disparity as long as his nutrition intake was sufficient. His stomach growled, spurring Luo Wen to crawl upward. He resolved to minimize his dirt consumption. Its energy conversion rate was dismal. It had also given him his first experience with insect digestion issues, a situation he hoped to avoid in the future. Near the surface, Luo Wen encountered a tangle of roots. Biting through a few, he drank the sap to replenish his fluids. As he carefully poked his head out of the ground, a nearby grasshopper-like insect leapt away with astonishing speed. Despite its quickness, Luo Wen clearly captured its appearance. That looks like a grasshopper, he observed. The insect was an oily green, resembling a locust. Its powerful hind legs marked it as a champion jumper, though it lacked wings. Its back was covered in a hard shell that split open during jumps, helping it maintain balance midair. C-37. Discovery. The grasshopper's abilities were impressive, especially its powerful hind legs. Unfortunately, it was highly alert. Luo Wen barely rustled the grass before it leapt away. Though it didn't jump far, the lush vegetation severely hampered his eagle eye ability in this environment. No matter how sharp his vision was, it wasn't X-ray capable. He couldn't see through the dense underbrush. With his greatest advantage on the surface nullified, moving underground once more seemed safer. The ground near the lake was moist, and Luo Wen soon sensed movement. Approaching cautiously, he found a worm. This worm was different from the foul-smelling, ambush-prone one he'd encountered before. Its dark red body was less grotesque and lacked the repulsive stench. It wriggled through the soil with rhythmic undulations. To Luo Wen, such a chance meeting was fate. He decided to take a bite. The more genetic fragments he added to his gene pool, the better. Who knew when they might come in handy? The foul-smelling worm's ability to extract nutrition from dirt had been invaluable in a crisis, even if the experience of consuming it was unpleasant. Encountering a new species of worm presented an opportunity to gain another useful trait. Perhaps by collecting and combining different worms' abilities, Luo Wen could eventually achieve the ultimate dirt-eating efficiency, without any digestive side effects. Grabbing one end of the worm, Luo Wen unceremoniously shoved its dirt-covered body into his mouth. This worm was unimpressive, offering no resistance to his attack. Perhaps due to his prior experience with far worse flavors, the earthy taste and faint stench of this worm were relatively tolerable. After consuming half the worm, Luo Wen let it go. Remarkably, even with half its body gone, the worm remained lively, burrowing into the soil and disappearing within moments. Its vitality was enviable, but Luo Wen already possessed the ability to regenerate lost limbs. The absorbed genetic fragments seemed to enhance his recovery further, subtly strengthening his resilience. Still, he was far more interested in the spider that had ambushed him on the cliff. Obtaining its genetic fragments could be transformative. Although spiders weren't insects, Luo Wen wasn't a traditional bug, either. The Iphiash species to which he belonged defied Earth's definitions. While they resembled insects during their early stages, their genetic makeup was a patchwork of various creatures. If categorized, they were more akin to a swarm species than true insects. At this point, Luo Wen might be the last surviving member of his kind. Pondering his battle with the spider, Luo Wen recognized the vast disparity in power. A direct confrontation was hopeless, especially given its venom. Without poison, he might have been able to rely on his armor to endure. But the spider's venom rendered its attacks devastating. If a solo fight was out of the question, perhaps overwhelming it with numbers could work. By rallying his brood, Luo Wen could emulate the yellow earth ants, sacrificing weaker individuals to exhaust the spider's venom reserves before swarming it. The plan was feasible and aligned with his goal of building a collective. Not everything had to be a solo effort. For now, finding a new nesting site took priority. Once he had secured a location, he could bring the rest of his swarm. An ideal site would be near ant nests, as ants were plentiful and provided valuable resources. It didn't take long for Luo Wen to encounter a familiar network of tunnels underground. Emerging onto the surface, he spotted numerous black ants. Upon closer inspection, he realized they were the same species as the black ants from the desert. This discovery simplified matters. Luo Wen altered his pheromones and brazenly infiltrated the black ant's nest. The layout of the tunnels felt familiar, and Luo Wen followed the largest pathway to the incubation chamber, where he found some old acquaintances. As the saying goes, old enemies meet, and sparks fly. A few well-aimed acid spits dispatched them. After examining the incubation and storage chambers, along with the number of soldier ants, Luo Wen estimated the nest contained over 5,000 members. The abundance of resources near the lake was evident. Even a randomly encountered ant nest dwarfed those in the desert. After a hearty meal courtesy of the black ant's supplies, Luo Wen emerged from the nest and began scouting the surrounding area. The presence of such a large nest suggested the absence of major threats. Otherwise, the relatively weak black ants couldn't have grown to this size. Luo Wen decided to explore above ground. The underground offered little beyond roots and worms, while the surface held the promise of diverse genetic material. Cautiously crawling through the underbrush, he occasionally startled grasshoppers of various colors and sizes. These grasshoppers typically rested on grass blades and were highly vigilant. Luo Wen's size made silent approaches nearly impossible, so he hadn't yet had the chance to showcase his talents to them. He also encountered numerous new insects, though most lacked distinctive traits worth assimilating. Having recently feasted, Luo Wen wasn't particularly hungry and didn't bother engaging them. Among his discoveries were many black ants foraging for food. Underneath a rock, a group of worker ants was dragging out a segmented, half-cylindrical insect covered in a tough carapace. This creature had numerous joints and small legs but had curled into a ball to defend itself. The worker ants couldn't breach its armor but surrounded it persistently. Whenever the insect attempted to uncurl and escape, they swarmed it, forcing it to retreat into its defensive posture. This was only delaying the inevitable. A massive soldier ant, guided by several workers, was making its way through the grass. Soon, the battle resumed. The armored insect's defenses were no match for the soldier ant's formidable weaponry. After a few exchanges, it lay gravely wounded, its body severely damaged. The workers swarmed over it, dismembering it into smaller pieces for transport back to the nest. Elsewhere, Luo Wen noticed black ants on plant stems, tending to green, translucent aphids. Surprisingly, the ants didn't attack the aphids but patrolled around them diligently. Periodically, the aphids lifted their abdomens, excreting a sticky liquid, which the worker ants scraped up with their mandibles. Moments later, the ants regurgitated a semi-solid, jelly-like substance, feeding it mouth to their companions. Watching this, Luo Wen recalled eating something similar in the ant nest earlier. The sweet, syrupy flavor had been quite enjoyable. Now, however, the thought of its origin filled him with nausea. C-38. The Migration 1. Luo Wen deeply regretted his sharp eyesight and cursed himself for watching the entire process. A rare delicacy, why did he have to witness how it was made? How could he bring himself to eat it now? It was a devastating blow to a foodie like him. He turned away, determined not to look again, and focused on scouting the area. With his view obstructed, Luo Wen managed to search only a few hundred meters around him before nightfall. He discovered 4 ant nests, all belonging to black ants. These nests were relatively large, likely due to their ability to rear other insects. A more diverse food supply allowed them to sustain a larger population. As for a new location to establish his own nest, Luo Wen had made his choice. He selected the intersection at the center of the 4 black ant nests. While it was somewhat risky, Luo Wen had become quite adept at concealing his lair. These black ants could only dig so deep underground. Luo Wen planned to build his nest in the deeper layers, as he had done before. Above this, he would construct a transit station completely disconnected from the main nest below. The subterranean brood nest would be like an isolated island, only linked to the upper transit station during food transportation. With his mission accomplished, it was time to return. It was already late, so Luo Wen decided to rest for the night and head back at dawn. The next morning, Luo Wen emerged from the ground, stopped by a nearby ant nest to snag a meal, and began crawling towards the cliff. Recalling his harrowing experience on the cliff last time, Luo Wen decided to scale a different section. His hooked claws gripped the rocky surface tightly as he hoisted his body upward. Climbing was a physically demanding task, especially for someone of Luo Wen's rounded physique. His size required extra effort, but it also came with advantages. His sturdy, powerful limbs allowed him to better withstand strong winds. It was a double-edged sword. Carefully, he examined the cracks in the cliff, staying vigilant for any sudden ambushes. If attacked, Luo Wen was prepared to launch himself away instantly, even if it meant starting the climb over. This time, however, he encountered no attacks. It seemed the cliff-dwelling spiders were few and far between, and he had simply been unlucky the last time. It took him the entire day to climb the cliff. By evening, he finally reached the top, exhausted from the effort. The extended time was due to the grueling nature of the climb and a period of strong winds during which he had to take shelter in a rock crevice. Only when the wind subsided did he resume his ascent. The desert above the cliff presented minimal danger, so Luo Wen decided to travel through the night. By the following evening, with only a few brief rests, Luo Wen had completed the journey in 1 day and 1 night. A trip that had previously taken him over 2 days was now halved. Calculating the time spent, Luo Wen estimated that the entire round trip, including time for recuperative rest, had taken about a week. Back at the brood nest, everything was mostly intact, except for the depleted food stores. There were no other losses. Most of the insects were conserving energy by lying motionless on the ground. Only a few smaller worker ants were feeding the larva. Luo Wen also spotted over a dozen tiny black beetles nearby. It seemed the first batch of cultivated eggs had finally matured into adults. Unsealing the chamber housing the brood nest, Luo Wen provided it with some food before linking with it and uploading the newly acquired gene fragments. As for the migration of the nest, Luo Wen had devised a plan during his journey back. The current nest population, including adults, larvae, pupae, and unhatched eggs, exceeded 1,000 individuals. Adults comprised the majority, followed by pupae and larvae. Since the brood nest had long ceased laying eggs under Luo Wen's orders, there were only a few unhatched eggs left. Luo Wen instructed the insects to consume all remaining food. Each adult was to carry a larva, pupa, or egg. Luo Wen himself would connect to the brood nest, while the black beetles formed a phalanx beneath it, linking their armored backs together to create a makeshift platform to support and transport the brood nest. With everything prepared, the migration began in earnest. Burrower ants took the lead, digging a tunnel to the surface. Although communication with Big Black was impossible, Luo Wen had initially intended to leave it behind. However, when Luo Wen and the black beetles began dragging the brood nest out, Big Black trailed closely behind. On the desolate landscape, a giant beetle pulled a fleshy lump, which was visibly supported by numerous smaller beetles below. Behind them followed hundreds of ants, each clutching larvae or pupae in their mandibles. This motley crew of disparate insects marched in harmony, united in their slow but purposeful advance. The procession's speed was inevitably slower than Luo Wen's solo pace. At their current rate, it would take about a week to reach the cliff. The black beetles fared relatively well, occasionally finding tender tree branches to sustain themselves. The ants, however, could only lick tree sap for hydration. Luo Wen wasn't sure how long they could survive on just water. Determined to ensure future resilience, Luo Wen resolved to incorporate soil-eating genes into the next batch of larvae. At least then, hunger wouldn't be as dire an issue. Each evening, Luo Wen led the insects in excavating a temporary burrow. The nights were chilly, and while the adults could manage, the larvae suffered. On the first night, Luo Wen overlooked this issue, resulting in the loss of all remaining eggs and several larvae. Pupae were unaffected, but 2 newly emerged adults also succumbed to the cold. Insects, being protein-based, didn't go to waste. Luo Wen ordered the others to consume the dead to replenish their energy. As they journeyed onward, even the sparse yellow earth ants seemed to vanish. Days passed without encountering a single one. A week later, the migration army finally reached the cliff. Their numbers had dwindled from over 1,000 to just over 900. Losses occurred daily due to various reasons. Most fatalities were larvae that failed to survive the inadequate nutrition, followed by weak newly emerged adults or individuals lost along the way. Whatever the cause, those were now in the past. They had achieved their initial goal. But ahead of them lay an even greater challenge. C-39. The migration 2. Luo Wen led the migrating swarm to the safe route he had scouted earlier. After a bit of adjustment, the army began their descent. At this stage, the black beetles were of little use. Luo Wen selected several large worker ants and positioned them around the brood nest. Each ant bit onto a corner of the nest, and together, they lifted it incrementally toward the cliff. Luo Wen took the lead, acting as the base by propping the brood nest up from below with his body. Around him, 7 or 8 ants stabilized the nest, ensuring it didn't tip over. The rest of the insects began following suit, climbing down the cliff in an orderly manner. As the swarm moved slowly along the cliff face, Luo Wen bore the immense weight of the brood nest with his mandibles and digging limbs. Despite his robust body and sturdy limbs, he found it increasingly difficult to bear the strain. To make matters worse, as the swarm reached the midpoint of the climb, the previously mild winds began to intensify. The increasing wind pressure took a toll on the swarm. The strong winds caused some ants to lose their grip, their mandibles releasing larvae or pupae, which were immediately swept away. Others couldn't hold on to the cliff at all, plummeting into the abyss below. Luo Wen couldn't spare attention to the others, his own situation had become precarious. 2 of the ants gripping the brood nest were blown away, while 3 others clung on with only their mandibles. Their bodies flailed helplessly in the wind. The loss of several ants destabilized the brood nest's center of gravity. The remaining ants, along with Luo Wen, struggled to keep it steady in the fierce wind. The nest toppled backward off Luo Wen's head. He clamped onto it with his mandibles, trying to catch it. However, the downward force of the falling nest pulled Luo Wen away from the cliff, and they plummeted together. During the fall, the wind shifted their trajectory slightly. Fortunately, the combined weight of Luo Wen and the brood nest lessened the impact, and the drop was only about 20 meters. They landed in a dense thicket below, which cushioned the fall. The brood nest, being naturally tough, sustained no damage. Luo Wen, with his experience from past falls, was also unscathed. 5 worker ants that had been attached to the nest fell alongside it. Being lighter, they were only slightly disoriented and otherwise unharmed. Luo Wen quickly dug a pit and buried the brood nest to protect it. He then started marking pheromone trails along the cliff base to guide the scattered insects. By nightfall, Luo Wen had only managed to gather a few dozen insects, including 2 black beetles, 1 burrower ant, and several worker ants, along with a few larvae and pupae. With no other options, he decided to rest for the night. The following day, he spent the entire time gathering more insects but only managed to find a few dozen more. Combined with the previous day's count, the swarm now totaled barely over 100. The cliff crossing had been devastating. While the week-long march through the desert had cost only a little over 100 insects, the cliff climb had claimed several hundred in just a few hours. Further searching was futile. Thankfully, the brood nest remained intact. After another night's rest, Luo Wen unearthed the brood nest and set off toward the new nest location with the remnants of the swarm. The reduced numbers weren't entirely a disadvantage. The survivors were mostly robust adults, with only a few larvae and pupae. Luo Wen hauled the brood nest himself, supported below by black beetles and several ants. With fewer insects to slow them down, their travel speed increased significantly, and their smaller size made them less conspicuous. Previously, Luo Wen had worried that the swarm's size would make it difficult to remain hidden while traversing multiple ant nests to reach the central location. That concern was now moot. The new nest site was only 300 to 400 meters from the cliff. The streamlined migration party reached it quickly. On the way, they encountered a few scout ants from an unknown nest. After Luo Wen demonstrated his performance skills, the scouts contributed their bodies to the swarm's long overdue feast. Upon arrival, Luo Wen assigned 2 burrower ants to start digging. One had been found the previous day, and the other was located during the journey. The worker ants assisted by carrying the excavated soil outside. Meanwhile, Luo Wen circled the new nest site, using his pheromones to mark the area as a no trespassing zone. This precaution aimed to deter scout ants from disturbing the insects at work. The excavation progressed rapidly once Luo Wen joined in. After all, he had previously managed to dig out a nest alone while hauling the brood nest. Now, with his significantly larger size and dozens of strong helpers, the work advanced even faster. A small mound of soil began forming at the entrance, evidence of the soil being transported out. Due to the proximity to a water source, the soil was moist, and the underground environment was damp. Luo Wen recalled observing the nearby ant nests, where he had noticed many areas lined with fine sand and wood shavings. He had even seen ants removing moldy shavings from their nests. At the time, he hadn't understood the purpose, but now, as he dug his own nest, the reason became clear. He marveled at how these seemingly simple creatures had developed survival strategies passed down over countless generations. Such knowledge was the crystallization of time. Luo Wen's own experience as an insect was brief, so absorbing these accumulated lessons was the best way to build his foundation. The pheromone barrier proved effective. By nightfall, no scout ants had ventured into the area. The insects had dug a small chamber about 7 or 8 meters underground. They couldn't go deeper due to water seepage, which made the soil unstable and prone to collapse. Even the current depth would require significant reinforcement to ensure safety. With the main nest unfinished and uninhabitable, Luo Wen dug a temporary nest about a meter underground to house the brood nest. In case of an emergency, the brood nest could be buried quickly, and the insects would scatter to draw attention away, ensuring its safety. Though an attack was unlikely, Luo Wen ensured all precautions were in place. He ventured out again to perform, returning with a few more victims to feed the swarm and the brood nest. By the following day, the simplified nest should be complete. After some basic reinforcement, it would be ready for temporary use. Once the brood nest resumed production, they could expand and fortify the nest further, including constructing transportation tunnels to link the surrounding ant nests, a task that would require a substantial workforce. C40. Development and conflict. 2 leisurely months passed, and the insect hive underwent a dramatic transformation. Above the hive, a decoy transit station had been established. 4 spacious tunnels now connected it to the surrounding 4 ant nests. Worker ants scurried back and forth through these tunnels, transporting food from the ant nests to the transit station. Each evening, the tunnels between the transit station and the hive were reopened, allowing the food to be transferred into the hive. Above the transit station, the soil excavated during the digging of the hive and tunnels had been piled into a tall mound. This mound not only prevented rainwater from flooding the tunnels but also concealed large, unprocessed food stores, including the corpses of numerous sentry worker ants. Thanks to the steady influx of resources from the 4 ant nests, the hive thrived. The number of adult insects exceeded 1,000, and there were over 2,000 eggs, pupae, and larvae. These newly bred insects were not ordinary ants. Their genes had undergone significant upgrades, transforming them into hybrids that retained the appearance and behavior of ants but were composed of traits from multiple insect species. When the temporary hive was first established, Luo Wen had instructed the brood nest to produce over 200 burrower ant eggs, incorporating soil-eating genes to ensure their survival in the harsh early conditions. Burrower ants were not only capable of performing all the functions of regular worker ants but also excelled at excavation. The 4 connecting tunnels, spanning over 1,000 meters in total, were a testament to the capabilities of these new ants. With the tunnels completed and a stable food supply secured, Luo Wen shifted focus to breeding worker ants equipped with formic acid spraying abilities. These ants had poor close combat skills but excelled in food transport and long-range combat support. The next step involved developing new soldier ants. Using the standard soldier ant template, Luo Wen integrated various gene fragments. These upgrades resulted in visible differences in their weaponry. Some bore the hook-shaped mandibles of yellow earth ants, others had enlarged mandibles resembling those of black ants, and a few were equipped with massive jaws akin to those of black beetles. In addition to enhanced weaponry, the new soldier ants inherited the robustness of black beetles, combined with their original soldier ant traits. As a result, their mature forms were significantly larger and more powerful than standard soldier ants. There were also a few specialized breeds. Among them were scout bugs, equipped with exceptional vision capable of seeing over 20 meters. However, their limited intelligence hindered their ability to report findings effectively, necessitating further upgrades. Another innovation was the spy bug. With the 4 ant nests spread out, Luo Wen couldn't personally infiltrate them and transport food daily. Thus, he developed this species, capable of altering their pheromones to blend in. Unfortunately, their limited intelligence initially resulted in poor performance. However, after a month of meticulous training under Luo Wen's guidance, the spy bugs eventually learned to complete their tasks independently. Despite occasional shortcomings, they became responsible for stealing food from the ant nests, a decision Luo Wen made with careful consideration. The spy bugs had decent safety measures. Black ants couldn't detect their disguises and, at most, notice the traces they left behind in the stolen tunnels. Even if the theft was discovered, Luo Wen wasn't worried. The hive had grown considerably in strength. Although the ant nests outnumbered the hive several times over, Luo Wen was confident in his ability to defeat them if necessary. If not for the efficiency of the worker ants, some of the nearby ant nests might have already been eliminated. Just a few days ago, the southeastern ant nest discovered one of the stolen tunnels. Several scout worker ants infiltrated it, followed by a significant military force. The hive responded immediately. The transport team worker ants, doubling as scouts, marked the retreat path with pheromones as they slowly withdrew from the tunnel. Soon, the hive's soldier ant corps entered the tunnel, and the transport worker ants stopped retreating, falling in behind the soldiers as they advanced toward the battlefield. When the two forces met, there was no preamble, they clashed instantly. The soldier ants blocked the tunnel while worker ants launched surprise attacks, biting antennae and pulling at limbs. However, the hive's side had a trump card: a ranged attack formation. Several rounds of formic acid sprays devastated the enemy worker ants, inflicting heavy casualties. Even the more durable soldier ants suffered burns to their eyes and antennae. The hive's insects, having been modified with acid-resistant genes, were unaffected by the sprays. Aside from gaining a glossy sheen on their carapaces, they sustained no damage. Without the support of their worker ants, the ant nest soldiers couldn't withstand the hive's fully intact army. The hive's worker ants swarmed them, immobilizing their limbs and leaving them vulnerable to the giant mandible soldier ants, who swiftly decapitated them. Led by the soldier ants, the hive forces broke through the enemy ranks. Some worker ants followed closely, while others lagged behind to finish off injured foes. The assault reached the enemy's incubation chamber. Only Luo Wen's intervention prevented the hive from completely annihilating the nest. As the losing side, the ant nest had no choice but to accept defeat quietly. Post-battle reports revealed that the hive had lost 9 soldier ants and several dozen worker ants, while the enemy nest suffered devastating losses, 71 soldier ants and nearly 1,000 worker ants, leaving it crippled. The hive, despite its losses, gained a substantial haul of ant corpses, a valuable protein-rich resource. Most of these war spoils were stored in the mound above the transit station. However, food supplies from the defeated nest sharply declined afterward. This prompted Luo Wen to reflect deeply. Why resort to such hostility? Couldn't disputes be resolved peacefully? Even if conflict was unavoidable, couldn't it have been less severe? Though leading the swarm's charge had been exhilarating, crippling the ant nest ultimately hindered the hive's growth. In a gesture of goodwill, Luo Wen temporarily closed the stolen tunnel to allow the nest time to recover. Fortunately, its eggs remained unharmed. Luo Wen hoped that with this recovery policy, the nest would soon resume its role as a resource provider and perform even better. Luo Wen didn't participate directly in the battle, as his significantly larger size rendered him unsuitable for the tunnels. His involvement would have blocked pathways and hindered the effectiveness of the swarm. Reflecting on the war, Luo Wen noticed a marked increase in the intelligence of this new generation of insects. Previously, they behaved like simple machines, requiring constant instructions. Now, they displayed traits akin to rudimentary AI, capable of performing complex tasks and even learning. What caused this change? Luo Wen speculated it might be the hive's continuous growth or the interaction of diverse gene fragments. This was merely a hypothesis, requiring further observation and experimentation. Regardless of the cause, Luo Wen regarded this development as a promising sign. C41. Revenge. After several days of post-battle recovery, the hive not only replenished its losses but also slightly increased its total population. As the brood nest grew, its daily egg-laying capacity also improved. Depending on the complexity of the insects being bred, it could now produce anywhere from a few to dozens of eggs daily without overburdening itself. Eggs that hatched into soldier ants were the least produced. Their complex genetics demanded significant resources, making them a costly but powerful asset. Even with the support of 4 ant nests, Luo Wen's hive could only sustain fewer than 100 soldier ants. On his own, such numbers would be entirely unfeasible. Today, Luo Wen had a critical mission in mind. One that had been gnawing at him like a thorn in his side. Although he didn't consider himself a vengeful insect, the matter of losing an appendage demanded retribution. He set out with a formidable force of 30 soldier ants, 100 worker ants, and all the scout bugs at his disposal. The group advanced in a grand procession. The spider's ambush had occurred 5 or 6 meters up the cliff. Though Luo Wen's pheromone markings from that time had long since dissipated, he could still discern the general direction. His sharp, high-resolution vision compared the current landscape to the mental image he'd retained. It didn't take long for him to identify the area. Crawling along the base of the cliff, he soon found the rocky crevice where the spider had hidden. With the location confirmed, the group began their ascent. As they neared the crevice, the formation spread out to encircle it. While Luo Wen was sure of the location, he couldn't guarantee the spider was still there. Cliff-climbing insects were rare, and with a spider of that size, waiting idly in one spot would likely lead to starvation. Carefully, Luo Wen poked his head out. His massive compound eyes, occupying nearly half his head, allowed him to observe the crevice with minimal exposure. Inside, he spotted a spider crouched in a corner, camouflaged perfectly against the rocky background. If Luo Wen hadn't known to look for it, he might not have noticed the creature at all. However, this spider differed slightly from the one that had attacked him. It appeared leaner, and its back was swollen with a writhing mass. A closer look revealed the movement came from dozens of tiny spiders crawling over the adult's back, a harrowing sight for anyone with arachnophobia. Beside the living spider was another spider, long dead and reduced to a desiccated husk. Luo Wen quickly deduced the situation. The female spider had devoured the male. While he had always known that male insects often met grim fates, witnessing it firsthand still sent a shiver through him. Whether the spider that had attacked him was this female or the deceased male no longer mattered. Luo Wen didn't hold grudges, this was simply a convenient excuse. The real objective lay in the genetic fragments the spiders carried. The timing was perfect. The female had just given birth, making her the ideal target. Despite his determination, Luo Wen remained wary of the spider's venomous fangs. While he would be the main combatant, he couldn't risk attracting the first wave of attacks. A solid strategy was essential. The idea of throwing rocks to test the waters crossed his mind, but given his physical limitations, such actions were impractical. Instead, he relied on his worker ants. Using his antennae, he relayed pheromone commands to the nearest worker ants, which quickly spread the instructions throughout the group. The ants chattered through antennae taps, and soon the entire formation was briefed on Luo Wen's plan. Without hesitation, the worker ants began the assault. They scurried into the crevice, leading the charge. The soldier ants followed closely behind, while Luo Wen lingered at the rear to oversee the operation. The spider reacted swiftly. An experienced ambusher, it immediately rose to face the intruders. However, the sudden influx of prey left it momentarily indecisive. The worker ants moved quickly. Equipped with their spring-loaded launch systems, they reached the spider's legs in an instant, biting down with their mandibles. Unfortunately, the spider's legs were too thick, and their efforts failed to inflict damage. Recovering from its hesitation, the spider lashed out. Its legs moved with blinding speed, striking down the surrounding worker ants. Half were sent flying. The luckier ones hit nearby walls and rejoined the fight, while the rest plummeted from the crevice to the ground 5 or 6 meters below. The fall wasn't fatal, but their poor vision made it nearly impossible for them to find their way back. Anticipating this, Luo Wen had stationed his scout bugs at the cliff's base. These large-eyed insects were tasked with locating and recovering any fallen comrades. While the worker ants failed to harm the spider, they effectively absorbed its initial attacks, successfully drawing its attention. The soldier ants, all equipped with spring-loaded launch systems, arrived next. Unlike the worker ants, their weaponry was designed for combat. Giant mandible soldier ants and giant fang soldier ants attacked the spider's legs, each limb gripped by multiple ants pulling in opposite directions. The spider was lifted slightly off the ground, its legs flailing in a desperate attempt to break free. However, the soldier ants' immense strength, combined with their unyielding grip, kept the spider immobilized. The hook soldier ants joined in, leaping onto the spider's back and startling the smaller spiders, which scattered in all directions. Using their hook-shaped mandibles, they latched onto the spider's head, their teeth piercing its eyes and driving deeper. The spider let out a sharp screech, retracting its front limbs to bite a giant mandible soldier ant clamped onto its leg. Unfazed by the attack, the soldier ant ignored the venomous fangs and continued its mission. Meanwhile, worker ants climbed onto the spider's legs, working their way to its back. The hook soldier ants withdrew their weapons, allowing the worker ants to gnaw at the exposed wounds. Unable to penetrate the spider's tough exoskeleton, the worker ants exploited the damaged areas, tearing at the vulnerable flesh. Gradually, they burrowed into the spider's body through its injuries. Despite its size and strength, the spider couldn't overcome the combined might of over 20 soldier ants. Its resistance waned as wounds accumulated and worker ants infiltrated its body. Finally, its struggles ceased, and its piercing cries fell silent. C-42. The spoils of battle. Luo Wen prided himself on being the main force of this operation, but to his surprise, all he contributed was his brain power. There was no opportunity for him to take action himself. Over the past 2 months, his combat strength had improved significantly. The giant spiders that once towered over him several times were now only about twice his size. However, no matter how confident he was, Luo Wen didn't believe he could take on a spider in a one-on-one fight. Its venomous fangs were essentially a cheat weapon, highly lethal and incredibly dangerous. One misstep could easily result in his defeat or even death at the hands of the spider. To his astonishment, such a formidable enemy was rendered utterly powerless in the face of the precise coordination of over 100 ants. Like a lamb led to slaughter, it was subdued without any opportunity to resist. This success made Luo Wen feel that the unconventional path he had chosen, diverging from other Ifiash, might have even greater potential. Moreover, the battle itself unfolded not solely based on his general plan but primarily on the instincts of the ants working together seamlessly. This realization was a wake-up call. Luo Wen resolved not to rely solely on his own strength to recklessly charge into danger. He could easily end up capsized in a ditch, just like this spider, overwhelmed by smaller opponents through teamwork. At this moment, the giant spider was already lifeless. Even if it were somehow still alive, it posed no threat. It could eliminate all the soldier ants and still be unable to deal with the numerous worker ants burrowing inside its body. The crevices of the cliff were teeming with panicked little spiders, which hadn't fully matured and posed no significant threat. However, they were an excellent source of protein. Adhering to his principle of wasting nothing, Luo Wen ordered the ants to hunt down the small spiders. But the little spiders were incredibly agile, scuttling deftly along the cliff face. After a lengthy effort, the ants managed to catch just over 20, while most of them escaped. Luo Wen wasn't concerned. Let them run. When they matured, they'd provide an even greater bounty of protein. The mission had been a complete success. The primary objective lay before him, and those minor details were not worth dwelling on. The giant spider was dragged to the edge of the cliff and thrown down. A height of 5 to 6 meters wouldn't cause it to stray too far, and there was no fear of other creatures stealing it. Any creature daring to challenge his claim would be asking to witness his skills firsthand. The team then climbed down the cliff. Luo Wen began dismembering the giant spider, personally hauling the largest chunk toward the direction of the brood nest. He also sent 2 worker ants ahead to summon reinforcements. After all, the spider was rather large. Nearly every ant in the group was carrying a piece of it, leaving little manpower for defense. If they encountered scouting ants from another colony on the way, it could become troublesome. As the worker ants gathered the scattered ones flung away during the battle, a compound-eyed scout bug arrived. Luo Wen took a head count. Besides 1 soldier ant killed in action, 2 worker ants were missing. All things considered, the losses were minimal. The 2 missing workers likely hadn't died from the fall. They might still be nearby and could make their way back to the brood nest on their own. Even if they didn't, it wasn't a big deal. Worker ants were the most basic units, easily replaced. On the return journey, they encountered reinforcements from the brood nest. Over 20 soldier ants accompanied by more than 300 worker ants. After the 2 groups merged, they collectively represented nearly half the brood nest's combat-ready force. With this, Luo Wen had no further worries about running into ants from other nests. They encountered a few scouting ants along the way. Before Luo Wen had a chance to act, the worker ants stationed on the perimeter immobilized them, allowing the soldier ants to move in and finish them off. Watching the orderly proceedings, Luo Wen finally felt a glimmer of what it meant to be a leader. Upon returning to the brood nest, Luo Wen directed the ants to pile the spider's dismembered parts in his room. Yes, in the new nest, he had carved out a personal chamber as his private space. The room was carpeted with dry wood shavings, sourced from an unknown type of tree whose roots the ants had severed. After the tree withered, the ants hollowed out its trunk to extract the shavings. This was a lengthy process, requiring far more time than Luo Wen could afford to wait for a tree to wither. These wood shavings had been looted from another ant colony. After dismissing the ants, Luo Wen gazed at the assortment of spider parts before him. It was finally time to enjoy the fruits of his labor. Due to the spider being dismembered into small pieces and its tough, bristly exterior being difficult to eat, Luo Wen didn't consume the entire spider. He only chose the meatiest sections. Calling in a few worker ants to clean up the leftovers, Luo Wen then fell into a deep sleep. The spider's genetic material brought significant changes to Luo Wen. As he slept, his body began secreting a mucus-like substance that enveloped him. The mucus gradually hardened, transforming into a cocoon. When Luo Wen awoke to find himself inside the cocoon, he knew immediately that this evolution was significant. Strangely, though, he felt no extraordinary sensations during his sleep. It was just an ordinary nap. Breaking free from the cocoon, Luo Wen felt a tinge of regret that his room lacked a mirror, preventing him from immediately seeing his new form. However, his eyes afforded him an expansive field of vision. With only a few blind spots, he could see nearly all of his body. Twisting and bending his limbs to examine himself thoroughly, Luo Wen found himself puzzled. Truthfully, his overall appearance hadn't changed much. His body remained mostly the same, with minimal external differences. However, his striding limbs had undergone significant transformations. Previously short and stubby, they had become long and robust, resembling a spider's walking legs. Thick and sturdy, they now featured numerous joints. Each limb consisted of 7 segments, making them incredibly flexible. The exoskeleton covering them was reinforced with durable chitin, adorned with sharp spines and bristles. At their tips were small claws, under which lay tufts of barbed adhesive hairs. Luo Wen recalled how the spider had pulled him back to the cliff with its sticky claws. Now, he felt capable of doing the same. Crawling around his room, Luo Wen discovered he could cling upside down to the ceiling and still move swiftly. What once required immense effort to climb vertically now felt effortless. This evolution of his limbs not only bolstered his offensive capabilities but also greatly enhanced his survival prospects. If he ever needed to escape, terrain would no longer pose a challenge. Beyond his limbs, Luo Wen noticed changes in his mouthparts. He now had a pair of venomous fangs in addition to his mandibles. Previously, he could only grip enemies and crush them with his mandibles. Now, with these venomous fangs, he could bite enemies and inject venom into them. Reflecting on the spider's potent venom, Luo Wen reminded himself to be cautious while eating. He wasn't sure if he had any resistance to his own venom. The last thing he wanted was to accidentally poison himself while eating. On second thought, it seemed unlikely. He could control whether or not to inject venom. Even if he lacked resistance, he wouldn't end up poisoning himself. C-43. Plans. Beyond the physical changes he observed, Luo Wen felt that his internal structure had also undergone significant transformations, though he wasn't sure of the specifics. If Luo Wen had more entomological knowledge, he might have deduced, based on the spider's physiology, that his oxygen delivery system had been overhauled. However, he would soon be able to confirm these genetic modifications through the brood nest. The new oxygen system was capable of supporting growth to much larger sizes. Despite these upgrades, Luo Wen hadn't gained the ability to produce silk. This wasn't entirely surprising. The creature resembled a spider in appearance, but Luo Wen had named it based on his own understanding. Who knew what it actually was? Moreover, its hunting method involved using rocks for ambushes, rather than showcasing any web-weaving abilities. Lacking the ability to spin silk didn't bother Luo Wen. The enhancements to his 6 striding limbs and the addition of venomous fangs alone were a major boon. Everything else would have been icing on the cake, desirable but not necessary. With his revenge complete, Luo Wen temporarily abandoned his thirst for action, allowing the region to experience a period of peaceful development. With the support of 4 nearby ant colonies, the number of insects under his control grew daily. Over time, the supplies from these colonies could no longer keep up with the demands of the brood nest. Recently, scout bugs with compound eyes had discovered 3 new ant colonies. Plans were underway to dig new transport routes. Once completed, the combined supply from all 7 colonies would sustain the brood nest's development for a while longer. Hundreds of days and nights passed. Luo Wen had no idea how long a year was on this planet. The climate in his region showed little variation. Every day seemed the same. Plants didn't follow any seasonal patterns of sprouting or shedding leaves, and there was no clear distinction between spring, summer, autumn, or winter. After all this time, the brood nest now connected to 35 ant colonies, supporting a vast swarm of over 10,000 worker ants and several hundred soldier ants. This number was deliberately capped by Luo Wen. Without such control, the population could have easily doubled. The primary constraint was the length of the transport routes. The farthest colony was nearly a kilometer from the brood nest. By the time the transport workers reached the storage chambers to steal food, they were often too exhausted to carry much back. After consuming a portion of the food on site, they transported the remainder back, consuming even more along the way. By the time they returned to the brood nest, little food was left. To quantify this, every morning, a transport worker ant consumed 1 unit of food before setting out. Upon reaching Colony 35's storage chamber, it ate another unit and carried back 2 units of food. After returning, it consumed half a unit of food before resting for the night. The next morning, it consumed another unit and repeated the cycle. From this, it became clear that transporting 2 units of food cost the worker ant 2.5 units, a net loss. Moreover, each colony had a daily limit on how much food could be stolen without disrupting its operations. Exceeding this limit would gradually reduce the colony's food output. Sustainable development required restraint, avoiding the "kill the goose that lays the golden eggs" scenario. As a result, the brood nest had halted its expansion several weeks ago. Even the colonies numbered 30 and above were rarely visited by transport teams anymore, with only a few spy bugs loitering there for sustenance. Luo Wen had considered a diet of pure dirt for all but found it impractical. Tests revealed that the energy gained from eating dirt was too minimal to support daily activities. It was only viable for emergencies, where the swarm needed to remain inactive, minimizing survival costs. In simpler terms, eating dirt allowed them to survive while idle but couldn't sustain normal operations. Now, the brood nest's development had reached a bottleneck. To break through, Luo Wen devised 3 potential solutions. Plan 1. Improve transport efficiency. While ants were strong, capable of carrying food several times their weight, they lacked suitable transport tools to maximize their potential. Currently, they relied on their mandibles for transport. If the food remained intact, they could carry larger pieces. Unfortunately, the stolen food was often already ground into smaller fragments. It was akin to a 1-ton truck with only the cab and no cargo bed, capable of carrying only a fraction of its capacity. If Luo Wen could find a way to enhance their carrying capabilities, the brood nest's influence could expand severalfold. Unfortunately, Luo Wen didn't know how to build cargo beds. He could only hope to encounter a bug species equipped with such a feature, allowing him to extract its genetic material. When or if that would happen was anyone's guess. Plan 2. Relocate the brood nest. The current brood nest was nestled against a cliff. In its early days, this location was advantageous, as it minimized the need to defend against enemies from all sides. Now that the brood nest had grown strong, relocating it to a more central area surrounded by numerous ant colonies could significantly increase its reach. Connecting to more colonies meant more stolen food, solving the current supply problem. However, this was merely a stopgap measure that didn't address the root issue. Furthermore, relocating such a large brood nest was no simple task. Even if they moved, it would take time to establish transport routes to the new colonies. During this transitional period, there was no clear way to sustain the swarm. Plan 3. Claim territory. The third plan involved clearing out nearby ant colonies and establishing a surface territory to produce food autonomously. 4 colonies were located close to the brood nest. To avoid conflict, Luo Wen's swarm rarely ventured above ground. Currently, all the food came from the colonies. This had created a warped ecosystem where the entire swarm, except the soldier ants, was essentially a massive transport team. Such dependence was unsustainable. By securing a patch of surface territory, they could produce their own food. For instance, they could raise the small green aphids found on tree leaves, expanding their scale using Luo Wen's intelligence. While this method of food production might seem unsavory, it would at least provide sustenance for his underlings. Compared to the first 2 options, the third plan seemed the most feasible. However, the worker ants from the nearby colonies were diligent and hardworking, making Luo Wen hesitant to disrupt their operations. His own laziness and lack of ambition caused him to put this plan on hold. Until a few days ago, when something unexpected happened. C-44. Assassination. In recent days, with some free time on his hands, Luo Wen used spider genes as a base and added compound-eyed scout bug genes to create specialized patrol spiders. These new units were tasked with monitoring the cliff face and scouting the desert atop the cliffs. A few days ago, one of these scout spiders reported that the Yellow Earth Ant Legion had reappeared in the desert. However, the scout's description was vague and unclear, prompting Luo Wen to climb to the top of the cliff himself to observe and gather more accurate intelligence. Peeking cautiously over the cliff's edge, Luo Wen activated his compound eyes, which had evolved over hundreds of days and nights, allowing him to clearly see within a 50-meter radius. In front of him, just 20 meters away, a dense swarm of yellow earth ants moved like a muddy yellow torrent, trampling and piling on top of one another as they surged past. The army shifted direction as it neared the cliff, rolling away like a massive tidal wave. Luo Wen watched intently for several hours until the entire horde had passed. The once green desert, which had briefly flourished after a period of recovery, returned to its barren and desolate state. Only a few straggling yellow earth ants wandered aimlessly, left behind by the main force. At last, Luo Wen understood the scenes he had witnessed on his initial journey through the desert. The yellow earth ants treated the entire desert as a hunting ground, sweeping through it periodically. No wonder this area, despite being close to an underground river, remained so lifeless. The sheer number of yellow earth ants left Luo Wen in awe. Comparing it to his own swarm of over 10,000 insects, which formed only a small heap, he couldn't fathom how many ants were needed to create such an endless yellow tide that marched for hours. Though the exact number was unclear, Luo Wen was certain it was astronomically high. Initially, upon witnessing the spectacle, Luo Wen had considered relocating the brood nest. Despite the swarm's recent growth in strength, he believed it would fare no better against the Yellow Earth Ant Legion than it had in the past. But upon noticing that the ants never approached the cliff, and recalling that his underlings now possessed the dirt-eating survival skill, Luo Wen decided that, in the worst-case scenario, they could retreat underground for several days until the army passed. Coupled with the logistical challenges of relocating the brood nest, Luo Wen abandoned the idea. Instead, his ambitions stirred. He dreamed of one day leading his swarm to confront the Yellow Earth Ant Legion head-on and exact vengeance for the time he had been gutted and forced to flee. Of course, Luo Wen wasn't a vengeful person. No, his motivation was to seek justice for the flora and fauna of the desert. To achieve the strength necessary for vengeance, or, justice, Luo Wen needed to expand his forces. The development of the brood nest was imperative, and clearing out nearby ant colonies had become unavoidable. Concerns about the diligence and contributions of the surrounding colonies no longer held weight. Today marked the start of the campaign, with the first objective being the elimination of the 4 closest ant colonies. Luo Wen planned to attack 1 colony per day, accounting for battlefield cleanup and inventorying the spoils, aiming to complete the operation within a week. Though the brood nest swarm could already overwhelm any single colony with sheer numbers, Luo Wen still insisted on devising careful battle plans to minimize unnecessary losses. The attack began with a covert operation. A dozen spy bugs altered their pheromones to move through the enemy colony undetected, heading straight for the queen ant's chamber. The queen's chamber was a tunnel-like room where an enormous queen ant lay at the center. It resembled a worker ant magnified several dozen times, with an elongated, swollen abdomen adorned with yellow, ring-shaped patterns. 4 sturdy soldier ants stood guard around her, while worker ants lined up to feed her mouth to mouth. A few others busily transported freshly laid eggs from her abdomen. The sudden intrusion of a dozen ants into the chamber caught the soldier ants' attention. However, after a brief inspection with their antennae, they detected nothing unusual and returned to their posts. The spy bugs, based on the worker ant template, had been modified with genes for pheromone alteration, rapid acceleration, and formic acid spray attacks. However, these were only the older versions. Carrying morsels of food, several spy bugs approached the queen ant, feigning an intention to feed her. Meanwhile, the others dispersed, moving toward the soldier ants. Though the soldier ants appeared uneasy as the spy bugs approached, they did not react aggressively and allowed them to climb onto their bodies. In an ant colony, stepping on one another was common, particularly for soldier ants accustomed to being climbed on due to their larger size. Once on the soldiers' backs, the spy bugs extended a retractable needle-like mouthpart, initially coiled like a tape measure. The tape straightened, becoming as sharp as a steel needle, and slipped into the gaps in the soldier ant's armor. The soldiers seemed unaware of what was happening. After the battle with the spider, Luo Wen had contemplated arming the new spy bug models with venomous weapons. These units were designed for infiltration, intelligence gathering, and the assassination of key targets. Luo Wen had sometimes questioned whether such complexity was necessary for creatures of limited intelligence. But memories of the black beetle, war god, being ambushed to death, the venomous spider overwhelmed by coordination, and the vast Yellow Earth ant army reminded him that these creatures, while not highly intelligent, possessed instincts and evolutionary adaptations honed over millennia. Underestimating them would be unwise. Developing multi-unit tactics could serve as both a practical strategy and a form of personal amusement. When it came to the venom, Luo Wen realized during development that spider venom required the use of fangs. Since worker ants lacked the space for an additional set of fangs on their small heads, attempting to add them would result in underdeveloped, ineffective weaponry. Moreover, worker ants were primarily suited for ranged support and auxiliary roles, making close combat enhancements unnecessary. Considering the high energy costs of producing venom-equipped eggs, Luo Wen deemed it an inefficient investment. This led him to recall the camouflage bug, a classic example of defeating the strong with the weak. Its needle-like mouthpart, while limited, was ideal for the spy bug's assassination role, delivering venom precisely to vulnerable spots. Thus, the scene of the spy bugs assassinating the soldier ants unfolded. Suddenly, the soldier ants began convulsing, their coordination failing. They stumbled, their bodies trembling in pain, unable to stand. The black beetle had died painlessly, succumbing silently due to the camouflage bug being of a similar size. In contrast, the size disparity between the spy bugs and the soldier ants was immense, with the former being several times smaller. The venom stored in the spy bugs wasn't enough for an instant kill. Nevertheless, the venom was sufficient to render the soldier ants' muscles useless, leaving them incapacitated and writhing in agony. For these soldiers, death would have been a kinder fate. C-45. The assault begins. When the queen ant detected the abnormality among the soldier ants, it became alert and released a pheromone signaling for protection. However, it was too late. The queen was already surrounded by numerous assassins. Almost at the exact moment the queen realized something was wrong, 7 worker ants disguised as feeders charged forward. 6 of them latched onto the queen's 6 striding limbs, pulling them backward. The remaining one climbed onto the queen's back and ejected a retractable proboscis like a tape measure. Despite its desperate struggles, the queen, used to being fed and clearly lacking physical exercise, was unable to overcome the 6 spy bugs holding it down. Its large body was firmly restrained. The nearby worker ants of the hive were momentarily stunned. These attackers bore legitimate identifiers, making it difficult for the hive ants to comprehend why their supposed companions would attack their queen. By the time they decided to help, it was too late. The 2 quickest responders were intercepted by spy bugs that had not yet joined the main attack. The proboscis extended like a steel needle and pierced the queen's armor at its joints. Within moments, the queen, like the soldier ants earlier, curled into itself, writhing in pain. In this primitive hive lacking effective medical treatment, the queen's muscles began dissolving internally. Its fate was sealed. The spy bugs didn't wait for the queen's death. The queen could still struggle for a long time, but their mission was complete, and they needed to retreat before the hive could fully react. First, however, they had to deal with the few hive worker ants obstructing their path. Several spy bugs advanced to entangle the worker ants, while others raised their abdomens, aiming their stingers. With precision, acid sprays hit the hive worker ants directly. The already outnumbered worker ants were further debilitated by this long-range bombardment. Their antennae and armor began to dissolve. Without antennae, the worker ants became like blind and deaf soldiers, losing most of their combat capabilities. After a brief resistance, they were subdued by the spy bugs. Taking advantage of the hive's disorganized state, the spy bugs withdrew to the hatchery, opened the smuggling tunnel, and scattered misleading pheromones. Unaware of the true situation, the hive worker ants and soldier ants, driven by instinct, followed the unfamiliar pheromones. To them, this was a critical part of the hive, and any anomaly needed immediate attention. Unfortunately, the moment they entered the smuggling tunnel, they were ambushed by the brood nest troops waiting in the shadows. A worker ant cautiously poked its head out of the tunnel's exit, its antennae probing for danger, only to have its head pierced by the powerful mandibles of a giant mandible soldier ant, which dragged it out of the tunnel. The giant mandible soldier ant turned, and 2 worker bugs stepped forward to grab the lifeless body hanging from its jaws, tearing it free and passing it to the rear to avoid clogging the tunnel. The subsequent ants passing through the tunnel were treated similarly. The dead bodies were handed down the line like a grim relay until a worker bug at the back dragged them toward the brood nest. The giant mandible soldier ant cleared the area of obstacles and resumed guarding the tunnel. Another oblivious victim poked its head out of the tunnel. One after another, the hive ants were slaughtered and their bodies transported to the rear. Some were worker ants, others soldier ants. It wasn't until the hive had lost over 100 ants that no more heads emerged from the tunnel. By this point, the strange behavior in the queen's chamber had finally been discovered. After prolonged agony, the queen succumbed to its injuries. The news of the queen's death spread through the hive as pheromones, causing chaos among the ants. At this moment, they no longer cared about the strange scents in the hatchery. After all, over 100 of their companions had already pursued the trail. Surely, everything would be fine. Some ants attempted to rush out of the hive's main entrance, but it had already been surrounded by the densely packed brood nest troops. Dozens of soldier ants blocked the exit, while hundreds of worker bugs supported them at their feet. Meanwhile, the outer perimeter forces of the brood nest were not idle. They had been tasked with eliminating all returning members of the hive. One by one, the worker ants, some carrying resources and others returning empty-handed, were intercepted by scout bugs before they even realized the danger. These bugs grabbed the worker ants' limbs, pinning them in place, as the giant mandible soldier ants or giant fang soldier ants stepped forward to behead them with their sharp tools. The bodies of these external hive members were then dragged by the worker bugs to a designated pile. Once the battle concluded, These high-quality protein sources would be taken to the mound above the brood nest, where they would undergo preservation treatments before being buried as reserves. At the hive's entrance, ants poured out continuously, and the fighting intensified. After all, this was a hive with over 5,000 members, hiding vast numbers of ants within its tunnels. The increasing pile of severed limbs and bodies, belonging to both hive and brood nest forces, began clogging the tunnel. With less room to maneuver, the bottle's ferocity gradually diminished. The worker bugs assisting the brood nest soldiers started dragging away the remains of both allies and enemies, clearing the field and retreating to rest. The rear worker bugs quickly moved forward to fill in the vacated positions. Exhausted soldier bugs also retreated, giving way to others while resting in a designated zone, where they consumed ant flesh to regain strength. Insect wars were merciless. Losing more than 2 walking limbs meant losing balance and mobility, effectively a death sentence. Such disabled individuals had no choice but to continue fighting to the death or be recycled as protein by their comrades post-battle. Once the tunnel was cleared, the intensity of the battle surged once more. More hive members, upon learning of the queen's death, rushed recklessly out of the tunnel. The brood nest troops blocking the exit could no longer intercept them all. Many worker ants, stepping over both comrades and enemies, tried to breach the line. Reinforcements from the brood nest, both soldier bugs and worker bugs, surged forward, expanding the battlefield from the tunnel's entrance outward. As the density of hive members increased, a line of worker bugs advanced, forming a barrier and adopting a standard posture for spraying acid solution. The resulting acidic rain drenched the battlefield, covering a large area. While the brood nest troops, equipped with acid-resistant armor, regarded this as little more than a shower, the hive ants were not so fortunate. Their delicate antennae suffered devastating damage, and their exoskeleton armor began to corrode. Facing this blind and crippled enemy, the brood nest troops, already stronger, crushed their foes with ease. The battlefield was gradually pushed back toward the hive entrance. C-46. The assault continues. After several back-and-forth skirmishes, the hive's forces began to show signs of exhaustion. At the same time, the worker bugs of the brood nest had depleted their reserves of acid solution. Having observed from the sidelines for quite a while, Luo Wen finally moved to the front lines. His massive frame, several times larger than a soldier ant, became an unstoppable force. With the insects coordinating around him, he resembled a bulldozer, charging through the battlefield with ease. It wasn't that he was cowardly. Well, at the beginning, he might have been a little hesitant. Given his size, Luo Wen was an obvious target on the battlefield. While his growing body granted him immense strength and resilience, his structure also left him vulnerable to smaller foes. His back, in particular, was a blind spot that was hard to defend. If too many worker ants surrounded him, he couldn't fend them all off. Should they manage to climb onto his back, there wasn't much he could do to stop them. Although his entire body was encased in tough chitinous armor that the smaller combatants couldn't penetrate, his bulbous, unprotected compound eyes were a glaring weakness. It wouldn't take much for a worker ant's bite to cause irreparable damage. When the brood nest's task force had besieged the cliff spider earlier, these very worker ants had crawled through its wounds and burrowed into its body. Since hive worker ants shared the same basic template as their brood nest counterparts, they likely possessed the same tactics. Luo Wen had no intention of experiencing the fate of that spider. Moreover, his side held the upper hand, so there was no need for him, as commander, to charge recklessly into battle. Thus, during the intense early skirmishes, Luo Wen watched from a distance, occasionally intercepting a stray scout ant returning to the hive. Now that the battle had calmed somewhat, Luo Wen, his blood boiling with excitement, finally had his chance to join in. Several worker bugs climbed onto his dorsal armor to guard his back, ensuring no worker ants could ambush him. At his feet, dozens of worker bugs followed closely, protecting his striding limbs and intercepting enemies from the flanks. Behind him trailed a few soldier bugs guarding his rear. This setup allowed Luo Wen to focus solely on the enemies ahead. Though his large compound eyes were a defensive weak spot, their incredible refresh rate made it nearly impossible for the worker ants and soldier ants to evade his gaze. He snapped his mandibles around a worker ant's thorax and abdomen, applying just enough pressure to sever it cleanly in two, the lifeless halves dropping to either side of his jaws. Luo Wen extended a striding limb, its clawed tip lashing out like lightning to hook another worker ant. Tiny adhesive hairs on the claw's pads clung to its prey as he pulled it back. His mandibles opened and shut, decapitating the ant in an instant. With a flick of his striding limb, he discarded the remains. Against opponents so far below his level, each one was dispatched effortlessly. Luo Wen couldn't help but wonder if his unique Luo-style insect combat techniques might become rusty from lack of proper use. Fortunately, a soldier ant from the hive soon appeared, charging directly toward him. Its size made it a passable opponent to test his skills. Grinning internally, Luo Wen assumed the opening stance of his combat style and advanced to meet the enemy. As the battle wore on, reinforcements from the hive ceased emerging from the tunnel. The remaining hive forces on the surface, now without fresh troops, were quickly isolated and eliminated. Luo Wen swung his antennae side to side, releasing new pheromone instructions. The worker bugs guarding his striding limbs dispersed. Moments later, a strike team of over a dozen soldier bugs charged into the hive's tunnel, followed by 100 worker bugs providing support. Simultaneously, several reserve units underground received Luo Wen's updated orders via messenger bugs. Inside the hive, numerous tunnels were breached by burrower ants, their figures quickly widening the openings. Following them, large groups of worker bugs surged in, led by soldier bugs. Within moments, brood nest units attacked the hive from multiple directions. The hive's fighting forces had long been exhausted. The few stragglers left offered no meaningful resistance. Without their queen ant, there was no centralized command, leaving them to fight as individuals. Before long, multiple brood nest squads converged in the hive's hatchery. Under Luo Wen's command, some soldier bugs and their worker bug escorts fanned out to search the tunnels for any survivors. Meanwhile, the majority of worker bugs swarmed into the hatchery to claim the spoils. The finely ground food scraps were highly nutritious and easy to consume, top-tier provisions. Additionally, the hive's eggs, pupae, and larvae were excellent sources of protein, perfect for harvesting and repurposing. By midnight, the worker bugs transport teams were still shuttling back and forth through the underground passages. Their two-way lines stretched into orderly formations, operating with impressive efficiency. Luo Wen, as the supreme commander of this operation, considered his work done and retired to his quarters for the night. Post-battle statistics showed that over 5,000 members of the hive had been virtually annihilated. A few scout ants scattered far afield had avoided capture, but their numbers were negligible. Thanks to excellent tactical execution, the brood nest lost only a few hundred worker bugs and just over 20 soldier bugs. Luo Wen couldn't be bothered with exact figures. First, in this vast brood nest, he was the only one who could count. As its highest-ranking officer, he needed only an approximate idea. Second, the corpses of their fallen, be they enemy or ally, were piled together in a jumble of severed limbs, making it nearly impossible to determine precise numbers. The next morning, Luo Wen observed the still bustling brood nest and made adjustments to his original plans. The goal of taking down one hive per day was temporarily postponed. Luo Wen had underestimated the logistical challenges of post-battle operations. For one, the worker bug's acid solution reserves would require several days to replenish. Acid solution, with its ability to blind and burn enemies, was a critical auxiliary weapon in war. However, once depleted, it took considerable time to regenerate. The massive gains from annihilating this hive would also require the brood nest to process its spoils over time. Being near a lakeside meant high humidity, which made food difficult to preserve. If 4 hives were conquered in rapid succession, the resulting surplus would likely spoil before it could be consumed. The insects of the brood nest were creations of the brood nest mother, who shared an intimate, undisclosed relationship with Luo Wen. Given how the insects treated Luo Wen's pheromone commands as divine orders, their bond was clearly profound. Thus, no insect dared oppose Luo Wen's decisions. For now, the brood nest troops halted their assaults on the remaining hives, shifting into a brief period of recovery and reorganization. C-47. Aphids. The brood nest, having recently received a large infusion of high-quality protein, was operating at full capacity. Every day, it worked diligently, ensuring productivity without compromising itself. The eggs it produced were primarily worker ant eggs, with only a few allotted to replenish the ranks of the fallen soldier ants. This war, which had mobilized over 10,000 combatants on both sides, provided Luo Wen with clarity on the optimal composition of the brood nest's forces moving forward. Under his command, which far surpassed the strategic capability of any ant, most of the battles were confined to narrow spaces, such as underground tunnels or hive entrances. This restriction meant that, at any given time, only a limited number of troops from both sides engaged directly. Apart from the larger number of soldier ants required to maintain the siege at the hive entrances, few were needed elsewhere. Soldier ants, useful only in combat, were essentially food-consuming machines. Overproduction during wartime risked a surplus after the conflict ended. To prevent unnecessary food loss, any excess soldiers would have to be recycled into protein stores. Given that a few hundred soldier ants sufficed for current needs, Luo Wen refrained from hatching more. In contrast, worker ants proved far more versatile and indispensable. First, during battles, they acted as auxiliaries, shielding soldier ants' limbs and backs. In direct combat, they could bite and pin down enemies, holding them in place for soldier ants to finish off. Against large enemy forces, they could spray acid to blind and incapacitate the opposition. Post-battle, they transformed into transport teams, cleaning the battlefield and collecting spoils. In peacetime, they tended larvae, maintained cleanliness within the brood nest, and managed emerging industries such as green insect ranching, which involved rearing aphids and collecting their secretions. For the brood nest, more worker ants equaled greater efficiency. Months passed. A silver torrent cascaded down a cliff, creating a majestic waterfall that churned into a misty spray, glinting like diamonds in the sunlight. At the base of the waterfall lay a shimmering lake. Gentle ripples spread across its surface under the caress of the breeze. Viewed from above, the once perfectly round lake had a small flaw, a cracked edge forming a winding stream that meandered into the distance. The lakeshore and stream banks were lush with greenery, vibrant and thriving. Several hundred meters from the lake stood a towering tree, its height reaching tens of meters. Its massive canopy cast a wide shadow over the land below. Clinging to the deep brown trunk was a black beetle, as large as a dinner plate. It stuck to the tree like an unsightly patch, disrupting the natural harmony of the scene. This was Luo Wen, surveying his domain. Over the past few months, the brood nest had conquered 7 hives in succession, expanding its territory to over 300 meters in radius. Though modest in human terms, for ants, most no larger than a fingernail, it was a vast realm. Previously, this territory supported 7 hives, each housing over 5,000 ants. Now, under the brood nest's control and supplemented by resources from over 20 neighboring hives, the population had more than doubled, surging past 20,000 individuals. The soldier ant count had just surpassed 1,000, alongside a few hundred specialized combatants such as spy bugs and scout bugs. The remainder were all worker ants, with a 3:7 ratio between those equipped with burrowing limbs and those without. Luo Wen discovered that insects with additional genetic modifications, such as specialized organs, not only cost more to produce but also required higher maintenance. While the extra cost per individual seemed negligible, the cumulative effect of thousands added up significantly. Thus, after careful calculations, Luo Wen settled on a 3:7 ratio. Worker ants with burrowing limbs primarily handled underground maintenance and food transport from other hives. Those without burrowing limbs, being lighter, were assigned to the brood nest's new enterprise, rearing aphids, small green, semi-transparent insects. Luo Wen had given them this name as a sentimental nod. 70% of the worker ants, over 15,000, were perfect for tree climbing tasks. Each day, these worker ants swarmed the vegetation within the territory, diligently nurturing the once meager aphid population. Originally, the aphids, limited in mobility, rarely moved unless they exhausted the leaves beneath them. However, under Luo Wen's guidance, the worker ants carried the aphids to new plants, enabling them to propagate more effectively. After feeding on the plants, the aphids produced semi-transparent droplets, which the worker ants collected by massaging the aphids. These droplets were consumed by the ants, who then regurgitated the surplus to feed their companions. When all had eaten their fill, the remaining droplets were stored in designated areas to dry. Over time, the evaporated liquid left behind pale yellow crystals, sweet, rare treats that were easy to store. Knowing their origin, Luo Wen refused to eat these aphid products. Don't ask how he knew what they tasted like. However, aphids were pests to vegetation. As their population flourished, the plants within the territory suffered. Leaves were stripped bare, depriving the plants of the photosynthesis they needed to survive. Recognizing the issue, Luo Wen realized that his earlier practices resembled overfishing, threatening to deplete his resources entirely. Drawing on his human experience, Luo Wen devised an ingenious plan. He noticed that ants also excreted waste, which worker ants collected daily and deposited at specific sites. Plants near these sites thrived, their growth enhanced by what Luo Wen deduced was fertilization with organic waste. Unfortunately, ant waste was too sparse to fertilize the vast number of plants in his domain. Even the daily output of tens of thousands of ants was insufficient. After pondering the problem, Luo Wen hypothesized that the low waste production stemmed from the ants' diet, which was primarily aphid secretions. Such a liquid diet likely explained the minimal excretion. Would solid food increase waste production? Sometimes, a wild thought leads to innovation. Recalling his only personal experience with solid food digestion since becoming an insect, Luo Wen had a sudden realization. The battlefield was full of solid food, ready to be processed. C48. Fertilization. Currently, every insect in the brood nest possessed genes allowing them to consume soil. With this talent, the entire ground became a buffet of solid food. If solid intake was needed, they could eat as much as desired. Luo Wen's idea was swiftly implemented. He began by selecting 500 worker ants for an experiment, instructing them to consume soil daily and deposit the resulting biofertilizer near designated plants. The results were remarkable. The same number of worker ants consuming soil produced several times more biofertilizer compared to their previous diet. During this period, Luo Wen also ordered the ants to stop assisting the aphids in migrating. Whether aiding plant growth would succeed still required further trials and time. Thus, Luo Wen decided to pursue both paths simultaneously, researching biofertilizer while curbing the aphid population. The biofertilizer experiment was a resounding success. Perhaps aligning with natural laws, the fertilizer produced from soil consumption was significantly more effective than that derived from aphid secretions. Initially, only 500 ants were assigned to consume soil daily, but this mandate soon expanded to include every insect in the brood nest, except for Luo Wen himself and the spy bugs lazing in the hatchery. With over 20,000 insects producing biofertilizer daily, the output was substantial. Luo Wen hatched additional worker ants specifically tasked with distributing the fertilizer across the vegetation within the territory. Even with the plants being fertilized, the restriction on aphid numbers remained in place. The current aphid population already supplied the brood nest's needs with surplus left over, so there was no need to increase their numbers. With the vegetation crisis resolved, life returned to a steady rhythm. The absence of independent thought among the insects proved advantageous. They worked tirelessly, day after day, without a hint of complaint. Luo Wen had taken to climbing the tallest tree in his domain daily, perching on its trunk to observe the orderly busyness of the insects below. He disliked the damp, confined underground environment where he had once been forced to hide for survival. Now, as a burgeoning overlord of the area, Luo Wen felt no need to remain constantly cooped up. Suddenly, a commotion on a nearby tree trunk caught his attention. A group of worker ants, seemingly discovering something unusual during their activities, moved closer to investigate. As the dominant force in the area, the worker ants naturally took the lead in checking out anomalies. Whatever they found prompted the ants to release pheromones signaling for reinforcements. Passing worker ants stopped in their tracks upon receiving the signal. The number of ants swelled, encircling the spot as if preparing for a battle. What puzzled Luo Wen was that the vegetation in question wasn't far from him. From his vantage point, he could clearly see the worker ants, but there didn't seem to be anything of note within their encirclement. To Luo Wen, it appeared to be nothing more than an ordinary piece of bark. In the monotony of daily life, any novelty was a welcome distraction, and Luo Wen's curiosity was immediately piqued. He launched himself from the tree in a leap of faith, landing belly up in the grass below. However, his 7-segmented, highly agile striding limbs quickly flipped him upright with ease. He made his way toward the commotion. As he approached the worker ant's circle, Luo Wen began to notice subtle differences. The piece of bark, while seemingly identical to the surrounding wood, revealed faint insect-like contours under his high-resolution vision. Could it be a camouflage bug? Luo Wen wondered, his interest waning slightly. Both camouflage bugs and black beetles were common in this region beneath the cliffside forest and the desert shrublands beyond. These insects had flourished here, unrestrained by the restrictions placed on yellow earth ants, and existed in significant numbers. Despite their proliferation, camouflage bugs were weak combatants. Their ambush skills might be top tier, but their direct combat capabilities were pitifully low. Their camouflage, while impressive, was useless against worker ants, who identified threats through pheromones rather than sight. Once discovered, a few worker ants could easily eliminate them. As for black beetles, they were doomed if they didn't flee when discovered. If the worker ants called for reinforcements, they would inevitably be reduced to protein reserves. Although worker ants lacked individual combat strength, their swarm tactics made them the dominant force in the region. They even managed to catch grasshoppers, which had once been a bane for Luo Wen, in significant numbers daily. Luo Wen, having tasted grasshoppers before, had been unimpressed. The only redeeming quality of grasshoppers was their strong hind legs, whose genes marginally enhanced his own limb muscles, not enough to replicate their leaps. Lost in his musings, Luo Wen suddenly noticed something unusual about this particular camouflage bug. The bark-like pattern wasn't an external covering but part of its natural coloration, seamlessly blending into its environment. This was a species Luo Wen had never encountered before. His curiosity reignited. A new species meant new genetic fragments to collect. Whether they proved useful was secondary, they were worth acquiring. Quickening his pace, Luo Wen reached the circle of ants. His antennae twitched, signaling the worker ants to part and allow him through. The new insect was smaller and slimmer than a typical camouflage bug, with notably sturdy shoulder and dorsal plates. Its coloration matched its surroundings perfectly, with patterns on its back blending flawlessly with the tree bark. The insect remained motionless, seemingly indifferent to Luo Wen's approach. Cautiously, Luo Wen extended a burrowing limb to prod the insect. The sheer size difference was staggering. His burrowing limb alone was nearly as large as the creature itself. The insect reacted to the touch as if it truly were a piece of bark, showing no response. Luo Wen applied more pressure, nudging the insect. Though it swayed slightly under the force, it stubbornly clung to the tree bark with its claws. Luo Wen almost laughed. Did this insect really believe that staying still would fool him? Feeling his intelligence insulted, Luo Wen swung his burrowing limb in a Luo-style combat technique opener, striking the insect directly. Despite its slender build, the insect was surprisingly resilient. It withstood the blow with minimal damage. Realizing its camouflage had failed, the insect abandoned its disguise. Releasing its grip on the bark, it pushed off with its short legs and dropped toward the ground. Something extraordinary happened. Upon landing, the insect's coloration shifted rapidly, blending seamlessly with the surrounding grass and leaves. In an instant, it vanished into its environment. C-49. Optical invisibility. Seeing the special talent displayed by the chameleon bug, Luo Wen's eyes lit up with excitement. He quickly jumped down from the tree trunk as well. The bug dove into the grass and disappeared. If Luo Wen hadn't kept his eyes fixed on it without blinking since the start, it might have truly escaped. His massive physique was now an advantage. Luo Wen charged after the bug like a tank, ignoring and crushing all obstacles in his path. The bug's body changed color as it scurried rapidly, blending seamlessly with its surroundings and making it nearly impossible to spot. Unfortunately for it, unlike grasshoppers, it didn't have powerful hind legs. Already locked onto its trail, Luo Wen quickly caught up after it wriggled through a few patches of grass. A long foreleg shot out like lightning, grabbing the bug by its carapace and dragging it to Luo Wen. Two burrower legs descended from above, pinning the bug down. Though it struggled fiercely, the power difference was insurmountable. A pair of giant fangs clamped onto the bug. With one bite, its struggles gradually ceased. Fresh ingredients often needed to be consumed promptly. Luo Wen didn't bother to move elsewhere and enjoyed a hearty meal on the spot before returning to his chamber to rest. When he woke up, Luo Wen discovered the secret behind the chameleon bug's abilities. The surface of Luo Wen's exoskeletal armor was now covered with a layer of extremely fine, densely packed scales. These scales contained nano-sized crystalline structures within their epidermal cells, forming a unique type of chromatophore. By controlling the spacing between the crystals, the cells could reflect light of different wavelengths. This adaptation allowed the scales to adjust rapidly according to their surroundings, reflecting the same light as nearby objects to deceive observers and achieve concealment. This newfound ability was particularly effective against individuals like Luo Wen with keen vision. Eyes are a highly complex and sensitive optical system, serving as crucial observation tools. They work by detecting light, projecting it onto light-sensitive retinas to form images, which are then converted into signals and transmitted to the brain. Light consists of numerous colors. The number of colors a creature can perceive depends on the types of photoreceptors in its eyes. Humans, for instance, have 3 types of color-sensitive receptors, allowing them to see 3 primary colors, whereas dogs only have 2. Luo Wen's eyes were far more advanced, capable of perceiving a broader spectrum of primary colors. Exactly how many he could see, he wasn't sure. By mixing primary colors in varying proportions, countless new colors could emerge, but these weren't primary colors. Comparing with his former self, Luo Wen noticed his current vision was far richer. For example, he could see a unique type of light that allowed him to determine the positions of the sun and moon on this planet, even without directly seeing them, and use it for navigation. Since transforming into an insect, this special light had cured his sense of direction. Navigation became second nature. Even so, the new camouflage ability could counteract this advantage. The ability worked by perfectly mimicking the reflective light of the surroundings. No matter how many wavelengths an observer could detect, they would find no differences. Previously, Luo Wen could only discern a bug-shaped patch on the bark by observing the spatial depth. Relying on his eyes alone, he couldn't distinguish it from the bark. But through cognitive analysis, he could deduce it was a bug. However, all of this depended on knowing beforehand that something was amiss. Without the worker ants alerting him to the anomaly, he could have stared at it all day and discovered nothing. Despite its exceptional focus, the ability had an obvious weakness. Creatures like ants, which don't primarily rely on sight, were unaffected, making it akin to dancing for the blind. The chameleon bug had been overly confident in its ability, even when surrounded. This led it to unwittingly gift Luo Wen its extraordinary talent. Though flawed in some respects, the ability was undeniably a remarkable form of biological black technology. Luo Wen had seen similar inventions online in his past life, such as special armors that used electronic screens to mimic and project the surrounding environment for optical deception. Yet, such devices were no match for the innate abilities of this evolved organism. Currently, this ability's greatest use for Luo Wen was making him less conspicuous when clinging to tree trunks, no longer resembling a glaring adhesive patch. With this little adventure behind him, life returned to normal. Days passed steadily, and the hive continued its orderly development. Within the radiation zone, the vegetation began to show subtle differences from the surrounding areas. Luo Wen implemented a new aphid management policy. Aphids were only permitted to consume older leaves when new ones had sprouted. If aphids overbred and consumed unpermitted leaves, worker ants would cull their numbers and recycle them as protein. Under this strict control, the vegetation within the territory flourished with the help of biological fertilizer. Abundant food led to a surge in the hive's population. When the numbers reached a threshold, a new wave of expansion began. Under Luo Wen's command, and while ensuring normal hive operations, all available bugs surged outward. With prior experience in territorial expansion, the bugs efficiently dismantled neighboring ant nests that previously served as food sources. This was not a contest between equals. Armed with superior tactical thinking and overwhelming numbers, the ants' resistance was easily crushed. After extending their territory by 100 meters in a fan-shaped arc, the hive army halted and began another period of consolidation. With the hive's growth on track, its development resembled a snowball rolling downhill. Experienced worker ants migrated en masse to the newly conquered areas to establish new aphid pastures. Correspondingly, the vegetation in these new territories received biological fertilizer treatment. The void left by their departure was quickly filled by newly emerged adults from the pupae. The hive's exact population had become unquantifiable to Luo Wen, given the daily attrition from various mishaps. These included casualties from skirmishes with black beetles, losses during exploration, and ambushes by unknown insects. For instance, underground, there was a type of creature resembling a foul-smelling earthworm that ambushed from below. It dug funnel-shaped pits on the surface, causing worker ants to slip in. At the bottom of the pit, the creature waited patiently. When prey fell in, it would spring up, using its massive pincers to capture and drag them underground for consumption. Most of these ambushers were concentrated in newly expanded territories. Though many were cleared after the hive took over, some managed to escape the sweeps, claiming unlucky victims daily. C50. The white dots. In addition to those insects that died accidentally, many new ones were born every day. With the hive's territory now vast, the insects were busier than ever, working tirelessly day and night. Gone were the days when only a few hundred insects would huddle together at night. Back then, Luo Wen could easily count their numbers in a matter of moments when he had nothing else to do. He sighed nostalgically at the simplicity of those earlier days, now long past. Today, he could only make rough estimates. The insect population had grown to at least 50,000. As time passed, Luo Wen began experiencing some headaches in recent days, as many insects had fallen ill. It was unclear when it started, but small white dots had appeared on the once shiny exoskeletal armor of the insects. At first, these white spots were few and scattered, appearing on the carapaces of just a handful of insects. But in a very short time, the dots spread rapidly, covering the insects' entire bodies. Before long, those afflicted with the white dots inexplicably perished. The worker ants followed protocol, recycling the dead into protein, but in doing so, they inadvertently spread the white dots to others. The white dots behaved like a plague, rapidly infecting more insects. By the time Luo Wen noticed and focused on the issue, hundreds of insects had already died from the affliction. Luo Wen felt a pang of guilt. It was a clear lapse in his management. Recently, he had been preoccupied with perching on tree trunks and enjoying the scenery. Furthermore, as his size increased, he had stopped living among the other insects. To accommodate his growing size, creating a tunnel large enough for him to access the underground would require substantial excavation, introducing potential risks to the hive, such as flooding during rain. The hive entrance was built atop a raised mound, which the worker ants had modified over time to resemble a miniature volcanic crater. This design allowed them to seal the entrance quickly during rainfall, preventing water from entering the nest or pooling around the entrance. If a larger tunnel were constructed for Luo Wen, sealing it during heavy rain would be nearly impossible for the worker ants, potentially endangering the entire hive. With his limited insectal experience, Luo Wen hadn't considered such issues in advance. Several weeks ago, a torrential downpour had drenched the area. At that time, his size was still manageable, and the tunnel wasn't excessively large. Even so, rainwater still flooded the hive, drowning a significant number of worker ants. Since then, Luo Wen had dug out a separate chamber near the hive for his own use, choosing to live alone. This isolation was the primary reason he failed to notice the white dot outbreak sooner. After identifying the problem, Luo Wen carefully observed an infected worker ant. To his surprise, the white dots weren't a disease but rather tiny insects. These minuscule parasites clung tightly to their hosts, using their mouthparts to pierce the exoskeleton and feed on bodily fluids. They reproduced rapidly, and once their numbers reached a critical mass, they could kill the host. Though Luo Wen identified the cause of the outbreak, he had no effective solution. The insects' combat abilities were designed for larger-scale threats, rendering them useless against the microscopic white parasites. While the adhesive hairs on Luo Wen's legs could pick off these pests, treating thousands of infected insects by himself was an insurmountable task. Hatching new insects equipped with adhesive hairs. The time required for eggs to develop into mature insects was far too long. By then, the infected population would likely be wiped out, directly producing adult insects from the brood nest. The process was inefficient, yielding too few to make a significant impact. Luo Wen had no choice but to isolate the infected insects and think of a plan. Just as he was about to hit a mental wall, a breakthrough occurred. He recalled the worker ant's formic acid, which was highly effective against enemies lacking acid-resistant genes. He decided to test it. The results were astonishing. The white parasites had no resistance to formic acid and were easily exterminated. A single acid rain session later, the hive was free of infections, and the insects returned to health. However, the root of the issue remained unresolved. Where had the parasites come from? Luo Wen, living in a monotonous world, found himself ruminating on the problem. Eventually, he formed a hypothesis. He had already dismantled over 20 ant nests but had never seen these parasites on ants. Likewise, the hive had been free of them until recently. This suggested that a recent change in the hive's environment triggered the outbreak. Luo Wen recalled the wood chips used by ants to keep their nests dry. These chips were made by gnawing on plant roots to create dried wood, which the ants extracted. Previously, the hive had similar wood chips. But since Luo Wen moved out, moisture control in the hive had been neglected. This was the only notable change in recent times. Whether this was the true cause required further observation. Luo Wen quickly issued new orders. The worker ants thoroughly cleansed the hive with formic acid and collected fresh, dry wood chips from nearby dried wood sources. Once arranged, the hive returned to its former dry and comfortable state. Over the next several days, no new white dots appeared, confirming that moisture was indeed the culprit. With the issue resolved, life returned to its usual rhythm. Months later, the hive's influence expanded outward by another 100 meters. Meanwhile, Luo Wen faced a familiar problem. When Luo Wen first decided to emerge from the underground and eliminate the surrounding ant nests, it was because the transport routes had become too long. Worker ants spent more energy traveling than they could harvest. This problem hadn't been fundamentally resolved, and now it had resurfaced. With the expanded territory, the hive's outermost boundaries were nearly 500 meters away from its core. Round trips were time-consuming and energy-intensive for the worker ants. This distance was already their operational limit. If the hive were to expand further, the issue would need to be addressed. Thus, the old plan to relocate the hive was revisited. This time, however, circumstances were different. The hive was now the dominant force in the area, able to migrate across the surface without risk. After careful consideration, Luo Wen selected a new hive location 50 meters from the current boundary. This site offered a safe buffer and room for future expansions. Even so, the relocation only provided a temporary fix. Once the hive expanded another 400 to 500 meters, the same problem would arise again. By then, relocating the hive alone wouldn't suffice. Luo Wen needed to devise a lasting solution during this period to resolve the issue once and for all. C-51. Observation. At Luo Wen's command, tens of thousands of burrower ants were the first to be mobilized, heading to the construction site of the new brood nest. They were soon joined by over 20,000 worker ants tasked with logistical support. These ants were responsible for transporting food to meet the daily needs of the burrower ants. Additionally, they handled soil relocation and the reinforcement of newly dug tunnels. In the past, Luo Wen personally led the excavation of the hive. However, now that he commanded tens of thousands of subordinates, there was no need for the highest-ranking commander to dirty his claws. Although there was no longer anything in the vicinity that could threaten the hive, Luo Wen maintained his characteristically cautious style. At a depth of 3 meters underground, the burrower ants constructed an impressive labyrinth of tunnels, intended as a decoy and transit hub, a fake brood nest. The real brood nest was located 3 to 4 meters below the fake one. This true hive, also a network of tunnels, was connected to the decoy by a single passage. Both ends of the passage were stocked with loose soil, ready to be sealed at a moment's notice. A team of spy bugs and burrower ants was stationed there permanently. Their mission was to seal the passage and deploy misleading pheromones if intruders breached the decoy, ensuring the true hive remained hidden. Luo Wen didn't see this strategy as overly cautious, it was simply prudent. He was wary of the Yellow Earth Ant Legion atop the cliff. If one day they lost their footing and charged straight down the slope, Luo Wen's hive would be their first target. Though the hive had grown much stronger, the gap in power between it and the Yellow Earth Ant Legion was still insurmountable. Direct confrontation remained out of the question, evasion was the safer strategy. Luo Wen firmly believed in the adage, preserve the green hills, and you'll never run out of firewood. He swore he would avenge his past grievances, eventually. Despite the ambitious scale of the new brood nest, it was completed at an impressive speed thanks to the collective efforts of tens of thousands of ants. With the old hive set to be abandoned, Luo Wen no longer needed to hold back. Personally digging his way down, he and the worker ants carefully dragged the massive brood nest to the surface. The brood nest, tireless and sleepless, consumed vast amounts of food daily, converting it into energy. Most of this energy went toward producing eggs, while the remainder fueled its own growth. Its sheer size only became apparent during the move. Now larger than Luo Wen himself, the brood nest's rotund form dwarfed the surrounding ants. Even with multiple tunnel expansions, its bulk barely fit through the passages. To put it into perspective, if Luo Wen was the size of a plate, the brood nest was like a giant watermelon. Worker ants, no larger than a fingernail, seemed like tiny specks around it. Countless worker ants swarmed beneath the brood nest, forming a layered platform to carry it. After numerous adjustments, the platform began to move. Luo Wen didn't participate directly. As the hive's supreme commander and strongest combatant, he focused on overseeing the operation and ensuring its security. After several hundred meters of careful relay work, the worker ants successfully transported the brood nest to its new location without incident. In the following days, the main passage and the brood nest's chamber were further widened. At last, the brood nest settled into its new home. The main passage was then narrowed once more, restored to its original state. The move to the new hive was a success, though there was no one to share Luo Wen's joy. By now, he was accustomed to the solitude of a life without social interaction. The swarm returned to its steady rhythm of growth. Resting, expanding, exterminating ant nests, absorbing territories, a repetitive cycle. Hundreds of days and nights passed, and the swarm once again approached the limits of its expansion. Luo Wen, however, already had a solution in mind: establishing branch bases. This idea had been on his mind for some time, and he had conducted several experiments. Initially, he used the queen ant's genes as a template, attempting to hatch a few hive-specific queens. These queens developed normally from eggs to maturity but failed to produce eggs once fully grown. Despite multiple rounds of experiments, the results remained unchanged. Luo Wen racked his brains but couldn't pinpoint the issue. Could the problem lie with the brood nest's queens being defective? Suspecting otherwise, Luo Wen decided to observe an ant colony for answers. He captured a colony of black ants, killed their queen and most of their members, and reduced their size for easier observation. This colony was confined indoors, with any ants attempting to leave promptly driven back by guard ants stationed outside the nest. Worker ants from the hive delivered food to the colony's entrance daily. Luo Wen dug a passage connecting to the colony and used his body to block the opening. His camouflage and pheromone abilities allowed him to blend seamlessly into the colony, making him as inconspicuous as a stone. Not a single black ant showed curiosity about him. To ensure no details were missed, Luo Wen gave up foraging. Worker ants periodically delivered his food through the passage. Luo Wen merely needed to turn slightly to eat before resuming his position. Prepared for a prolonged operation, Luo Wen was surprised by how quickly answers emerged. After losing their queen, the worker ants somehow managed to hatch several new queens and some strange ants Luo Wen had never seen before. Once the queens matured, they engaged in unspeakable acts with these peculiar ants. Shortly afterward, the strange ants perished without exception. Luo Wen discreetly used his adhesive claws to collect the corpses of these peculiar ants. Meanwhile, internal conflict erupted within the colony, as the new queens led their factions in a brutal power struggle. The defeated queens were killed mercilessly, while their followers surrendered to the victor. By the end of the war, only one queen remained, commanding the allegiance of all surviving ants. The colony resumed its familiar rhythm, laying eggs and raising larvae. Midway through this process, Luo Wen had already figured out the problem. But since he was bored, he decided to watch the drama unfold to its conclusion, treating it as entertainment. The peculiar ants, likely male ants, appeared only during the colony's early stages. After mating, they died shortly thereafter. When Luo Wen infiltrated ant colonies in the past, they had all been large, established nests with thousands of members, so he had never encountered male ants. The issue with the brood nest's queens lay in the absence of these males to complete the process. C52. Branch bases. This was an oversight Luo Wen hadn't anticipated, a blind spot in his thinking. Beyond his lack of familiarity with male ants, there was another factor. The brood nest had always produced eggs without needing external involvement. Perhaps the brood nest instinctively knew that if it required such a process, Luo Wen might have eliminated it long before it reached its current size. With the issue identified, Luo Wen extracted genetic fragments from the male ants. The brood nest soon began producing eggs for a few male ants. In time, the queens successfully laid eggs. However, the hatchlings were ordinary, unmodified ants, free of any advanced biological features. Fortunately, these creatures still obeyed Luo Wen's commands. Apart from their pheromone-based identification system, they also inherited the dual friend or foe recognition system. Characteristic of brood nest creations. Yet, this outcome fell far short of Luo Wen's expectations. He wasn't here to raise ordinary ants. If the swarm couldn't grow stronger alongside him, what would be the point of the collective's energy? Determined to achieve better results, Luo Wen conducted further experiments. Although the brood nest's origins lay in the genes of black ant queens, its mutations had transformed it beyond recognition. Luo Wen experimented with various combinations of his own genes and those of the brood nest. After countless trials, he finally devised a passable solution. The queens hatched using this new formula operated more like miniature versions of the brood nest. They could lay eggs without the need for male ants and even utilize optimized genetic combinations to produce specialized insects, such as burrower ants and spy bugs. However, they had their limitations. Firstly, their gene libraries were fixed the moment they detached from the brood nest. Unlike the brood nest, they couldn't synchronize with Luo Wen to continuously update their genetic repertoire. Secondly, they lacked the brood nest's capacity for relentless energy conversion. Bound by their smaller appetites and limited time, their growth was slower, and their egg production couldn't compare to that of the brood nest. These flaws, though inconvenient, could be mitigated. For example, the first issue could be resolved by periodically producing new queens to refresh the gene library. As for the second issue, while individual output was limited, there was no restriction on the number of queens that could exist. If one wasn't enough, produce two. If two weren't sufficient, try 10, or 100. The swarm's expansion accelerated dramatically. Simultaneously, the first batch of 10 experimental queen eggs was produced. While these queens matured, the swarm launched a frenzied offensive, wiping out dozens of ant nests in a short time. None of the 30-plus ant nests that once provided food for the hive were spared. All were annihilated, and their territories absorbed into the swarm. However, due to the distance, the new territories couldn't yet be developed or guarded. This was only a temporary issue. As the 10 queens matured, it was time for them to play their roles. Luo Wen equipped each queen with 300 burrower ants, 700 worker ants, and 50 soldier ants as their personal guard units. After assembly, the 10 teams set off in different directions toward the front lines. Their mission was to establish branch bases in the new territories, create additional aphid pastures, and utilize local resources to increase their numbers. They were also tasked with safeguarding their territories and the brood nest itself. Luo Wen was thrilled. If these experimental seeds proved successful, the swarm's growth would reach unprecedented levels. Finally, the prospect of defeating the Yellow Earth Ant Legion and avenging past grievances was within reach. Despite the emergence of branch queens, the brood nest's production continued unabated. After replenishing the forces assigned to the 10 queens, all new mature individuals were sent to support the front lines and branch bases. The queens, still limited in production capacity, focused on nurturing themselves while the branches grew steadily under the brood nest's support. As the branch bases expanded and the number of insects increased, new aphid pastures began to appear around them. The experiment proceeded smoothly. In the following weeks, the swarm resumed its relentless march of expansion. One by one, over 20 additional queens were dispatched with their personal guards to establish new branch bases in fresh territories. As the branch bases proliferated across the region, the swarm's activity radius grew significantly. Unlike independent black ant colonies, which formed separate systems with unique identification protocols, the brood nest's queens functioned as extensions of the hive. All branches shared the same identification system and pheromone-based network as the central hive. Insects from any branch could freely access the brood nest and other bases for rest and resupply. Luo Wen remained their supreme commander. Time flew by, with a new queen team departing every few days to secure new territories. Backed against the cliff, the swarm's influence now extended along the eastern lake's shoreline, rapidly expanding northward. Upon reaching the lake's northern end, the swarm split into two forces. One continued north, while the other followed the lake's edge eastward. Eventually, the eastern force encountered a river flowing from the lake. Turning north along the river, they rejoined the northern force. Meanwhile, a western force of 30,000 insects advanced westward. When the hive was weaker, Luo Wen had avoided the lake, staying as far away as possible. As a human, he had harbored an unexplainable fear of deep water. After becoming an insect, even small puddles seemed bottomless to him. Fear of the unknown only deepened his caution. He couldn't be sure what terrifying creatures might lurk underwater. As the swarm grew stronger, Luo Wen dispatched scouts to patrol the area. Nothing unusual occurred, though he climbed tall plants near the shore to observe the lake from a distance. Despite the calm surface, he couldn't see beneath the water. Over time, Luo Wen's wariness subsided. Though the swarm patrolled the area, he never expanded their territory to the lake. Now, however, the hive encompassed half the lakeshore. Ironically, Luo Wen found himself hoping something would emerge from the lake. Perhaps it could offer new genetic fragments for his collection. It had been far too long since his gene library had been updated. Alas, the lake's creatures adhered to a live and let live philosophy, showing no inclination to come ashore. C-53. A new enemy. As the hive continued to expand, a new problem emerged before Luo Wen. This issue was long-distance communication. With nearly 100 branch bases established, the network was vast. While the bases remained steadfastly loyal to Luo Wen's commands, he was completely unaware of their individual situations. And Luo Wen had no idea how to solve this problem. His knowledge was limited, making it impossible for him to create communication devices suitable for his swarm. Additionally, the insects' low intelligence rendered them incapable of acting as effective messengers or accurately reporting the statuses of the various branch bases. Thus, Luo Wen, who had been enjoying a relatively leisurely life, became busy once again. He began traveling daily to inspect the conditions of each branch base personally. The more he saw, the more astonished he became at the vastness of his territory. Merely doing a cursory circuit of all the branch bases took 3 full days and nights. If he stopped for a detailed inspection, the time required would double. The first round of inspections was accompanied by a sense of novelty and wonder at his expanding domain. By the second round, Luo Wen was already beginning to grow weary. By the third round, his thoughts had emptied, and his gaze had grown vacant. Luo Wen knew this couldn't go on. At this rate, as his territory continued to expand, he would work himself to death. He had to come up with a solution. But no matter how hard he racked his brains, he couldn't think of anything. So, the issue was postponed. After completing several rounds of inspections without encountering any anomalies, Luo Wen reduced the frequency of his patrols, opting to do them once every 10 days or so. But it was precisely during one of these patrols that an unexpected incident occurred. During a new round of inspections, Luo Wen discovered that the insects in one branch base, including the queen ant, had mysteriously disappeared. After multiple rounds of genetic adjustments, the queen ants had become emotionless and machine-like in their loyalty, eliminating any possibility of betrayal. This meant that they must have encountered some external factor that led to the current situation. Luo Wen dug into the nest to examine the remaining traces carefully. Pheromone residues were abundant everywhere. Upon analyzing them, Luo Wen made a discovery. The pheromones originated from the base's inhabitants and an unknown force. From the scent profiles, the unknown force seemed to be another ant species, similar to his own, but the violent and savage undertones revealed through the pheromones indicated they were far from as docile or disciplined as black ants. Luo Wen's first guess was the Yellow Earth Ant Legion. Could they have established a branch nearby? But he quickly dismissed this theory. The characteristics of the pheromones were completely different from the Yellow Earth ants. This was an entirely new ant species. Moreover, judging by the state of the branch base, their methods bore an unsettling resemblance to his own. Faced with the emergence of an aggressive neighbor, Luo Wen dared not be careless. He followed the pheromone trails, tracing them meticulously. Maintaining his characteristic caution, Luo Wen advanced slowly, frequently pausing to observe his surroundings and prepare to retreat at the first sign of danger. By now, his swarm consisted of over 100 branch bases, though rapid expansion had stretched his forces thin. Each base had an average of only about 2,000 insects. Even so, Luo Wen commanded a total of 200,000 insect followers. As their supreme commander, Luo Wen had to act with caution. His responsibility to his subordinates demanded it. If the insects weren't so woefully unintelligent, Luo Wen wouldn't even be handling the reconnaissance himself. Sitting safely in the rear and directing his army on the front lines was the image he preferred to embody. The pheromone trails led north, eventually leaving the hive's territory, before branching out in multiple directions. Luo Wen arbitrarily chose one path and followed it, arriving at an unfamiliar black ant nest. Unfortunately, he was once again too late. This nest was also abandoned, its inhabitants having disappeared without a trace. With no other choice, Luo Wen selected another trail that diverged from this point. After circling around for some time, he ultimately returned to the hive's territory and arrived at another branch base. Luckily, this time he wasn't late. A fierce battle was unfolding at the base's entrance. Amid the chaos, Luo Wen finally caught sight of the enemy. They were small ants, only about half the size of a black ant worker. Their heads and thoraxes were an eerie dark red, while their eyes, mandibles, abdomens, and legs were black with reddish hues. In addition to their standard ant features and unconventional coloration, they possessed short, sharp stingers at the ends of their abdomens, a clear indicator of their unique combat ability. Although their size was small, their numbers were overwhelming, and they were ferociously aggressive. The forward-most branch base had limited insect forces to begin with, essentially the standard outpost contingent assigned to remote areas, roughly 1,000 worker ants and 50 soldier ants. These defenders were rapidly losing ground. Dozens of soldier ant corpses were scattered near the base entrance, and the surviving soldier ants were few. As the main combat force and frontline shield, the soldier ants had been nearly wiped out. The remaining worker ants had also suffered heavy losses, with fewer than 300 still alive. They were now desperately defending the narrow entrance under the leadership of the remaining soldier ants. In contrast, the attacking red ants numbered at least 3,000. Strangely, their ranks also included many black ants, roughly another 3,000. Could it be that I've destroyed too many black ant nests recently? Did they go find reinforcements to seek revenge? Luo Wen was stunned. With the limited intelligence of black ants, could they even coordinate with reinforcements? Or was there more to the story? But there was no time for speculation. The dire situation demanded his immediate action. After ensuring there were no ambushes nearby, Luo Wen entered the battlefield. The red ants were no match for Luo Wen's overwhelming force. Despite their agility, they couldn't withstand his brute strength. Luo Wen's digging limbs swung wildly, smashing ants left and right. Even without precision, his sheer force incapacitated numerous red ants with each strike. Meanwhile, his walking limbs, tipped with sharp, spear-like claws, stabbed at the red ants with lightning speed, targeting their heads and abdomens, their largest and most vulnerable areas. Before long, Luo Wen's digging and walking limbs were covered in sticky fluids, and the ground around him was littered with red ant corpses. Standing amidst the carnage, Luo Wen exuded an aura of invincibility, evoking the image of an unstoppable force mowing down enemies. But this was a skirmish involving over 3,000 red ants. No matter how formidable Luo Wen was, his influence on the battle was limited. Moreover, his presence had drawn the attention of the red ant army. Though he had ambushed and killed dozens of them, the majority now turned their focus on him. C-54. Tracking. Faced with the onslaught of hundreds of red ants, Luo Wen swiftly dispatched a few of the vanguard attackers. However, the red ants showed no fear. The sight of their companions being killed did nothing to deter them. Instead, they seized the openings in Luo Wen's attacks and quickly closed in on him. Luo Wen's 8 legs moved rapidly, stabbing through one red ant after another. He flung their lifeless bodies away before thrusting down again. But there were simply too many red ants. Despite killing a handful, the remainder quickly swarmed up his legs, crawling toward his body. While the red ant's small size and limited weaponry posed no real threat to Luo Wen's armor, his head presented 2 glaring weak points that he couldn't afford to leave exposed to their chaos. Just as Luo Wen was preparing to act, a sharp pain flared from one of his leg joints. The sensation shocked him. This was the first time Luo Wen had felt pain since transforming into an insect. Even during extreme injuries, like being gutted, he had felt nothing. Yet now, he was in agony, and the pain only intensified. It was as if his tissue was melting, forcing a pained cry from him. What in the world? When did I develop a nervous system capable of pain? Luo Wen thought angrily. The sharp pain severely hampered his combat ability. Is this evolution or regression? If it's evolution, I'd rather do without it. Unfortunately, there was no time to dwell on his misfortune. Glancing at the source of his pain, he saw a red ant clinging to his leg joint. Its stinger had penetrated the thinner part of his armor, causing the excruciating sensation. A simple sting shouldn't have caused such intense pain. Luo Wen realized with horror. These little bastards use venom. How underhanded. Using another leg, he extended its adhesive tip, grabbed the offending red ant, ripped it away, and brought it to his mouth. Luo Wen crushed the ant into pulp with a furious bite. But in the brief moment of distraction, more red ants had climbed onto his body. They were clearly targeting the weaker joints in his armor and seemed eager to showcase their collective talents. Every hair on Luo Wen's body stood on end in alarm. Without hesitation, he began thrashing his legs and rolling wildly on the ground. Thankfully, his legs had a total of 7 joints, so even if 1 or 2 were disabled, he could still function effectively. Additionally, the smooth surface of his armor offered little to grip, and the red ants lacked the fine hair-like structures that spiders use for climbing. Luo Wen's chaotic rolling dislodged most of the ants clinging to his body. When Luo Wen stopped, only 3 red ants remained stubbornly attached to his leg joints. Their end, however, was even grimmer. They were individually grabbed by his adhesive limbs, ripped away, and crushed to death. The searing pain had cleared Luo Wen's head. This isn't a game, and I'm no invincible warrior mowing down hordes. A single mistake here could lead to my downfall. Resolving not to linger in battle, Luo Wen began retreating, his 8 legs moving swiftly as he ran and leapt toward the base entrance. Victory in this fight was impossible with the forces at hand. The only sensible choice was to retreat. Pheromones dispersed into the air, signaling his insects. Some climbed onto Luo Wen's back to protect his vulnerable eyes, while others retreated into the tunnels. Switching tactics, Luo Wen abandoned the goal of killing as many ants as possible. Instead, his 2 front legs swung back and forth, knocking away any red ants that came close. This defensive strategy allowed him to cover most directions on his own, leaving the remaining areas to the surviving soldier and worker ants. Before long, the worker ants inside the tunnels emerged, carrying the queen ant. Luo Wen extended a leg, stuck the queen ant to its adhesive tip, and placed her on his back. The remaining soldier and worker ants scrambled up after her, forming a small tower on his back. As the insect defenders evacuated the perimeter, the red ants pushed closer. Seeing the remaining dozens of ants struggling to climb aboard, Luo Wen sighed inwardly. He couldn't save everyone. He issued a final retreat order, wishing them luck, and bolted out of the battlefield at full speed. Along the way, he scattered random pheromones to confuse any pursuers. Some red ants followed his trail for a while but became disoriented by the mixed signals and eventually turned back. Luo Wen wasn't one to hold grudges, but being forced to flee like a whipped dog wasn't his style either, unless his enemy was as formidable as the Yellow Earth Ant Legion. After finding a safe spot, Luo Wen set down the survivors. They included one queen ant, 3 soldier ants, and a group of worker ants. He assigned 3 soldier ants and 10 workers to escort the queen ant back to the rear. The rest were instructed to search for the Northern Army, ordering them to retreat and halt any advances to avoid clashing with the red ants without his leadership. At this stage, Luo Wen still knew too little about the red ants. As the saying goes, know your enemy and know yourself. He needed to gather more information about them before planning his next move. For now, strategic avoidance was the best course of action. The Northern Army should be nearby, but due to the lack of communication tools, Luo Wen had to rely on spreading worker ants across the area to locate them. Once the army retreated, they would be redistributed among the branch bases. If the army remained stationary instead of advancing, consuming prey and destroying nests to sustain themselves, they would face serious supply issues. The Hive currently lacked an effective supply chain, so dispersing them across bases would allow them to be supported locally while also bolstering defenses. With everything arranged, Luo Wen examined his injuries. The joint on his poisoned leg had mostly healed thanks to his remarkable regeneration ability. The red ant's venom was potent, akin to spider venom, capable of dissolving tissue. However, their small size meant that the quantity of venom they could deliver wasn't enough to inflict serious damage on Luo Wen. Still, he had no desire to experience such pain again. And if their numbers were large enough, they could indeed threaten his life. During the battle, Luo Wen had devoured several red ants. If his genetic assimilation was successful, the next batch of eggs might yield insects equipped with stingers. Satisfied that his injuries were manageable, Luo Wen returned to the previous base. He needed to track the red ants to uncover their purpose in attacking his base, their origin, and the mystery behind the involvement of the black ants. These questions demanded answers. C-55. Preparing for Battle 1. When Luo Wen returned to the branch base, he saw black ants emerging from the tunnels. They were carrying not only food but also eggs, larvae, and pupae, and surprisingly, they didn't seem to be killing them. Are they planning to adopt these larvae? Luo Wen wondered, puzzled. At the same time, he noticed another strange phenomenon. The ones working were exclusively black ants, while the red ants stood idly by, showing no intention of helping. They appeared to be loafing about. An uncontrollable thought sprang to Luo Wen's mind. Could the theory he had jokingly entertained earlier actually be the truth? He adjusted his pheromones to disguise his identity and cautiously approached while observing their reactions, ready to flee at a moment's notice. Fortunately, the pheromone disguise still worked on the red ants, who didn't react to his approach. However, some red ants, for reasons unknown, suddenly began fighting each other. More than a dozen red ants locked jaws and wrestled fiercely, forming a chaotic melee surrounded by a large circle of spectators. Is this their idea of entertainment? Luo Wen mused. The erratic behavior of these tiny creatures baffled him, and he couldn't discern their behavioral patterns. Erring on the side of caution, Luo Wen refrained from venturing deeper into enemy territory. If one of these dim-witted ants decided to challenge him to a test of strength due to his size, it might blow his cover. Circling the enemy, he observed a critical detail. Both the red ants and the black ants shared the same pheromone markers. This meant they were on the same side. The red ants weren't hired reinforcements but part of the same group. This discovery reinforced Luo Wen's earlier suspicion. After a while, the black ants finished clearing out the branch base, and the army, laden with spoils, began their march. Luo Wen immediately followed at a safe distance. The combined force of thousands of red and black ants soon merged with another detachment, forming an army of over 10,000 ants. They left Luo Wen's hive territory and veered off to destroy another black ant nest, looting its resources and larvae. By now, nearly every black ant carried some cargo. The United Army resumed their march, this time heading straight back to their home base without diversion. Their destination lay more than 500 meters from Luo Wen's territory. As it came into view, Luo Wen saw a towering mound with a massive entrance resembling a volcanic crater. Countless red and black ants swarmed across the mound's surface. The recently returned army filed into the entrance with their spoils, but Luo Wen halted his advance. Without knowing what might trigger the red ants to start fighting opponents, Luo Wen wasn't about to charge recklessly into their lair. The interior was an unknown danger zone. If his cover was blown and hundreds or even thousands of venomous red ants surrounded him, he might not make it out alive. Luo Wen burrowed underground to scout the area. The nest's subterranean structure was vast, far exceeding any black ant nest he had ever encountered. Given the red ants' size, combined with the addition of numerous black ants, their numbers were staggering, easily exceeding tens of thousands. This was an alarming figure. Even though Luo Wen's hive boasted over 200,000 insects, most were dispersed across various bases to maintain operations. He could muster only tens of thousands for combat. That didn't account for the resources needed for transportation and supply lines. In a prolonged conflict, at least half his forces would need to focus on logistics. This war wasn't going to be easy. Yet given the habits of both sides, one of them was bound to be eliminated. Emerging from the ground, Luo Wen continued to shadow the red ant army, occasionally launching ambushes to capture a few red ants for food. Over several days of observation, Luo Wen learned more about the red ants. Their behavior resembled bandits. They didn't produce anything themselves but survived by looting. Their numbers far exceeded those in their lair. Numerous red ant detachments operated far from the nest, targeting primarily black ant colonies. They stormed the nests, killing the queen ants. For some reason, after the queens were killed, most surviving black ants submitted to the red ants. Those who refused were swiftly executed, while the rest were tasked with transporting resources and larvae. Red ant squads, typically numbering 2,000 to 3,000, returned with several times their number in black ants. Once brought back, the black ants tended to the larvae and searched the surrounding areas for aphids to farm. They also served as the red ants' reserve food supply. The red ants that attacked Luo Wen's branch base had likely returned early because they failed to subjugate additional black ants and were short on manpower. Thinking of the larvae taken from his branch base, Luo Wen's heart grew heavy. Though they resembled black ants, they were entirely different. They wouldn't submit to the red ants, and their fate was grim. The information Luo Wen had gathered troubled him. Based on his estimates, the red ant population alone exceeded 100,000. And that didn't include those operating too far afield to observe. On top of that, the black ants, numbering several times more than the red ants, were now loyal to them. These black ants didn't just refrain from resisting, they actively assisted the red ants, even joining their attacks. And in the red ant stronghold, where most red ants were out raiding, the sheer number of black ants far exceeded the remaining red ants. Yet there was no sign of rebellion, proving their unwavering loyalty. Perhaps the situation still held some variables. Luo Wen resolved to examine the genetic fragments he'd collected from the red ants upon returning to the brood nest. Perhaps they held hidden secrets that could explain their dominance over the black ants. With his reconnaissance complete, Luo Wen hurried back. The situation was dire. He was no longer planning to attack the red ants. Given their scale, Luo Wen lacked the means to eradicate them for now. If handled poorly, he might even face their counterattack. Traveling quickly, Luo Wen avoided several red ant patrols and entered his own territory. On his way, he stopped by a branch base to dispatch dozens of messenger teams, ordering all bases to bolster defenses. If they encountered the enemy, they were to immediately request reinforcements from nearby bases. After repelling the attackers, pursuit was strictly forbidden. Thanks to the brood nest's growth and the mixing of multiple genetic traits, the intelligence of Luo Wen's insects had improved significantly. The queen ants, in particular, seemed to have an innate intelligence boost. They could now understand more complex commands and had high priority in directing worker and soldier ants. Finally, Luo Wen felt like he had some semblance of military strategy. If he had to rely on the likes of Black 2 and Black 3's early intelligence, they'd never grasp the concept of mutual aid among bases. C-56. Preparing for battle 2. After arranging the frontline operations, Luo Wen wasted no time and rushed back to the Hive's main base. Upon reconnecting with the brood nest and conducting a thorough examination, he was surprised to find no genetic fragments from the red ants that could explain their ability to subjugate black ants. This was terrible news, and Luo Wen was at a loss. The red ants weren't using some genetic skill to dominate the black ants. Could it be their charisma? Are you kidding me? Luo Wen thought incredulously. Still, though the reason eluded him, the outcome was clear. Not dwelling on this mystery for too long, Luo Wen shifted his focus to adjusting the worker ant template. Originally, he intended to integrate the red ant's stingers into the worker ant's design. However, he discovered that the stinger was incompatible with the acid spray system. The conflict was not only positional. Both systems required the same area at the rear of the body, but also internal, with overlapping storage chambers for venom and acid. Faced with a choice, Luo Wen began to deliberate. Suddenly, inspiration struck. He realized that although the red ants were smaller than the black ants, their specialization in combat overproduction marked them as akin to soldier ants. This shift in perspective explained their exceptional ferocity. So, they're essentially a species where every member is a soldier ant, Luo Wen concluded. No wonder they were so aggressive. With this revelation, Luo Wen used the red ant template as a base, first altering their red pigmentation to black for uniformity in his forces. He then added features like acid-resistant armor, enhanced spring-like movement, reinforced chitin plating, and stronger mandibles. The resulting new ant type was a small soldier ant. These creatures were entirely combat-focused and undertook no production tasks. Their size matched that of the red ants, but they were stronger, with thicker armor and larger, tougher mandibles. Though slightly less agile than the red ants, the addition of the spring-like movement compensated for this drawback. Luo Wen gave them a simple name: small soldier ants. Not stopping there, Luo Wen developed two additional new species. The first was based on spiders, incorporating his own eye genes, the black beetle's carapace, and chitin-reinforced legs. This new species, called the transport bug, was designed for logistics. Using spiders as the base allowed for a large body size, and their nimble legs made them quick and agile. The beetle's wide back provided ample space for carrying materials. While primarily a support species, the transport bugs were no pushovers in combat. Their legs, sheathed in bone armor, could transform into spears, piercing enemies with precision aided by high-resolution vision. Luo Wen had personally tested this design and found it highly effective. The second species was a pure support unit named the adhesive bug. Modeled after regular worker ants, they were enhanced with the camouflage bug's adhesive traits. Their role was to assist the transport bugs by using their adhesive abilities to secure loads on their carriers' backs. Once the materials reached their destination, the adhesive would dissolve to aid unloading. Logistics would be crucial in the war against the red ants, especially given both sides' reliance on foraging and plundering for sustenance. In a prolonged conflict, the first to lose their supply lines would fall. The red ants, with their captive black ants serving as living food reserves and expendable soldiers, posed a unique challenge. What a headache, Luo Wen muttered, narrowing his eyes. If possible, he'd need to find a way to disrupt their operations. For now, though, Luo Wen focused on preparation. Due to the high energy demands of producing queen ants, the brood nest only produced 50, then switched to mass producing the 3 new species. The first batch of new queens would take time to mature. Until then, the production of the new species fell solely on the brood nest. Luo Wen ordered the existing queens to concentrate on producing worker ants. Worker ants were the swarm's only ranged attackers and were essential for reclaiming and developing territory after defeating the red ants. Their numbers needed to grow as much as possible. With the rear operations in order, Luo Wen returned to the front lines. His lingering concerns about his swarm's adaptability made his presence reassuring. In the following days, messenger units crisscrossed the territory, relaying Luo Wen's orders. He personally conducted reconnaissance in enemy-controlled areas, observing the red ants mobilizing their forces. Numerous detachments returned from foraging and began amassing along the border. The joint red-black ant army swelled to an estimated 200,000, with their numbers continuing to rise. The enemy swept through the borderlands, occasionally sending small raiding parties into the Hive's territory to harass and sabotage. 2 branch bases, too remote for timely reinforcements, were overrun and destroyed. However, most bases successfully repelled attacks with the timely arrival of reinforcements, driving the red ants away. The situation grew increasingly dire. A full-scale war was imminent. On Luo Wen's side, the newly developed species matured. From above, one could see large numbers of transport bugs marching on their 8 long legs toward the front lines. Some carried food, while others bore swarms of small soldier ants on their backs. Small soldier ants, due to their small size and limited energy reserves, weren't suited for long marches. Using transport bugs to carry them conserved resources. Though outnumbered, the swarm forces concentrated their troops and adopted a defensive strategy. Meanwhile, the vast outer territories became hunting grounds for the red ant army. Their foraging sustained their massive numbers despite weaker logistical capabilities. As the first 50 new queens reached maturity, they were escorted to the front lines by dedicated teams of transport bugs and guards. There, they began mass-producing small soldier ants on site. The brood nest, meanwhile, ceased small soldier ant production. After producing 10 more queens, it shifted entirely to creating transport bugs and adhesive bugs, reducing the burden of transporting small soldier ants. At the same time, restrictions on the aphid farms were lifted, drawing heavily on the swarm's vegetative reserves to maximize food production. When the first batches of small soldier ants emerged from their pupae, Luo Wen issued an order to redeploy the burrower ants from across the territory to the front lines. The burrower ants, previously tasked with digging tunnels and later relegated to fertilizing vegetation, now had a new purpose in Luo Wen's plan. Far-off groups of burrower ants rode on transport bugs, while closer ones traveled on foot. Over the next few days, they steadily arrived at their designated positions. Luo Wen tallied their numbers, which totaled over 50,000, representing 80% of the hive's burrower ants. C-57. The home raid begins. Luo Wen didn't want to stir up trouble just yet. The longer he could delay, the more advantageous it was for him. The foundation accumulated by the swarm required time to be converted into military strength. However, over the past 2 days of observation, it was evident that the size of the Red Ant coalition at the front line had exceeded 500,000. Their relentless scavenging of areas near the border had left these regions overexploited and severely depleted, making it increasingly difficult to sustain their daily consumption. Luo Wen even witnessed several groups of red ants turning on black ants in their own ranks for food. The situation had reached a critical point. The Red Ant coalition now faced a choice: either launch an offensive or retreat. The probability of retreat was low, which meant that an all-out war between the two sides was imminent. Time was of the essence. Over 50,000 burrower ants were prepared, with 500 ants riding on each transport bug. In addition, more than 5,000 small soldier ants were accompanying the convoy to provide protection. Due to their smaller size, each transport bug could carry 800 to 900 of them. The team also included a small number of scout bugs and spy bugs. Under Luo Wen's command, over 100 transport bugs marched briskly into enemy-occupied territory, carefully avoiding areas under surveillance along the way. An hour later, the unit arrived at its designated location. This spot lay along the riverbank, about 600 meters from the red ant's brood nest. Without delay, Luo Wen began excavating a channel from a point half a meter from the riverbank. His massive body functioned like a giant excavator, carving out a trench that extended toward the red ant's nest. The burrower ants followed behind Luo Wen, removing the displaced soil, expanding, smoothing, and refining the trench. Meanwhile, the scout bugs and small soldier ants spread out around the team to maintain vigilance, and the transport bugs climbed the surrounding vegetation to fortify their positions. The operation proceeded in an orderly manner, and progress was swift. Luo Wen single-handedly tackled the most challenging tasks, his large digging claws tearing through the hardened earth, conserving the stamina of the burrower ants behind him. The plan unfolded smoothly. Although a few enemy scouts crossed their path, they were swiftly eliminated, providing the team with a modest supply of protein reserves. However, as the excavation neared the enemy's nest, they encountered an increasing number of enemy troops, with steadily growing forces. Even so, the small soldier ants maintained their numerical superiority. Transport bugs were also deployed to patrol the periphery, pursuing any fleeing enemies to prevent them from reporting back. Meanwhile, spy bugs erased any pheromone trails the enemies left behind. When the team was within 20 meters of the enemy's nest, their presence was finally exposed. The prolonged combat had drained the unit's stamina, and the proximity to the enemy's brood nest meant that patrols were more frequent in this area. Although the swarm still held a numerical advantage overall, they could no longer intercept all the fleeing enemy troops. Eventually, a few managed to slip away and spread the alarm. Fortunately, the distance to their target was now minimal, and ants were not the most efficient communicators. Luo Wen, deeply familiar with the rhythms of ant colony operations, understood that it would take some time for the red ants to react. Seizing this window of opportunity, he abandoned any pretense of concealment and pushed forward with full force, digging directly toward the mini-volcano ahead. Simultaneously, 20 transport bugs carrying 10,000 burrower ants sped back to the riverbank. Their mission was to breach the half-meter barrier separating the river from the trench. Although the departure of 1/5 of the workforce slightly slowed the excavation, the overall impact was manageable. After about 10 minutes, with the small soldier ants fighting valiantly to cover them, Luo Wen breached the mini-volcano's wall, creating a large hole that exposed the dark, winding tunnels of the enemy nest. This was like striking a hornet's nest. Swarms of red and black ants surged out from the breach. Exhausted from digging the 600-meter trench, Luo Wen was barely holding on. The final meters had been sheer willpower alone. Now that the task was complete, the fatigue hit him all at once. Even lifting his digging claws became a struggle. Remaining in the area was a death sentence. Summoning the last of his strength, Luo Wen retreated a short distance. The burrower ants moved ahead to shield him, standing firm as the bicolored flood of ants surged toward them. The burrower ants crouched, aiming their rears forward in standard spray formation. Acidic spray. Thousands of burrower ants unleashed their acidic solutions simultaneously, dousing the advancing vanguard in a wave of corrosive fluid. The enemy troops faltered, overwhelmed by the saturation attack. While an individual burrower ant didn't carry much acid, the combined output of thousands formed a river of acid. The liquid pooled on the surface, unable to seep into the soil, flowing directly into the nest's depths. Many enemies didn't even have time to react before their limbs and antennae dissolved in the acid stream. Struggling in vain, they succumbed to silence. Having withdrawn to the rear, Luo Wen began issuing commands. He ordered a few worker ants to scavenge ant remains from the battlefield so he could replenish his strength. Next, he directed 20,000 burrower ants to the volcano's mouth to block the entrance. Any enemy that emerged was greeted with a fresh spray of acid. The remaining burrower ants held the newly dug breach, ready to meet any escaping enemies with the same treatment. The small soldier ants and transport bugs guarded the flanks. Since the main force of the enemy was trapped inside the nest, the scattered patrols outside could still be held at bay. Half an hour later, despite several enemy charges, the swarm held firm, repelling each assault with concentrated acidic sprays. Using acid to block the tunnel entrance amplified its lethality exponentially, far surpassing its effectiveness in open field battles. However, the repeated waves of self-sacrificial charges weren't without effect. The burrower ants' acid reserves were rapidly depleting. One more assault, and they'd likely run out. Just then, a distant rumbling reached their ears, the sound of rushing water. The trench, now filled with water, surged toward them, carrying the corpses of burrower ants that had sacrificed themselves to complete the task. Luo Wen knew all too well that the respiratory systems of insects like these were highly vulnerable to flooding. The final task of breaking the river's barrier had been perilous, and many had drowned in the attempt. But their sacrifice had not been in vain. C-58. The home raid ends. The water flowed continuously into the breach in the ant nest for a full 2 minutes. The surging current carried with it soil and a torrent of red and black ants, sweeping them out of the tunnels. At the entrance, the turbulent waters clashed back and forth before eventually stabilizing. The water level inside the nest equalized with the outside, and the surface of the water gradually calmed. Near the entrance, the water was littered with countless red and black ants. Most of them had not drowned immediately and were still desperately struggling on the surface. Some of the luckier ones managed to climb onto the bodies of their companions and painstakingly make their way to the riverbank, where they struggled to crawl ashore. However, what awaited them on land were the burrower ants, standing ready to strike. The terrain inside the nest was complex, and only a small fraction of the ants had been swept out by the water, the majority had perished below. This raid on the enemy's brood nest exterminated tens of thousands of red and black ants, at the very least. Most importantly, their stockpiled food reserves in the nest were completely destroyed. This blow exacerbated their already strained frontline supply situation. After eliminating the lucky survivors who made it ashore, the ants in the water stopped struggling one by one and began to float silently on the surface. Luo Wen ordered the burrower ants to turn back and support the small soldier ants, using up the last of their acidic reserves. While the combat strength of the burrower ants couldn't compare to the small soldier ants, their sheer numbers overwhelmed the battlefield in an instant. After clearing the battlefield, all corpses, friend and foe alike, were collected and processed into protein reserves. The army then boarded the transport bugs and quickly retreated toward the riverbank. Having just destroyed the enemy's nest, it was wise to leave the area quickly to avoid a frenzied counterattack from their frontline forces. Upon reaching the riverbank, the group regrouped with the burrower ants stationed there. A count revealed that of the 10,000 burrower ants who had breached the final barrier, only about 6,000 remained. Nearly 4,000 had been swept away by the rushing water in an instant. Adding to this were the losses from the final stretch of digging and the subsequent battle. Over 3,000 burrower ants were lost. The 5,000-strong small soldier ant force was reduced to fewer than 3,000, with nearly half falling in battle. Even among the robust transport bugs, 2 units had been lost. This battle cost over 10,000 troops from various classes, but the victory was spectacular. After a brief recovery, Luo Wen ordered the entire force to retreat. They traveled along the riverbank, carefully avoiding enemy patrols. The exhausted army couldn't endure any more disruptions. Fortunately, the journey back was uneventful. The army returned safely to the frontline command center, a location Luo Wen had ceremoniously named but was, in reality, just the nearest forward base. Currently, this base had become a major gathering point for the swarm. Excluding the returning burrower ants, there were still around 150,000 worker ants stationed here. The small soldier ants, due to their late production schedule, were still relatively few in number. Even with the addition of the 2,000 that just returned, their total barely reached 30,000. However, there were still over 10,000 original soldier ants from earlier generations. Including the transport bugs, the total number of combat-ready troops was just over 200,000. Even with the addition of the burrower ants, the number barely reached 250,000. Furthermore, the burrower ants had expended all their acidic reserves, reducing their combat effectiveness by at least half for the next few days. The enemy still had at least 500,000 troops, more than double the swarm's forces. Fortunately, about 70% of the enemy troops were black ants, and with Luo Wen's command, there was still a chance of victory. Moreover, the destruction of the enemy's brood nest created severe supply issues for their forces. While the swarm's rear lines were stretched thin due to the allocation of troops to the front, they could still barely maintain normal operations. Over time, Luo Wen's chances of winning would only increase. Thus, the swarm's current strategy was to hold their position, delay the conflict, and adapt to the situation. However, the Red and Black Ant Coalition had no intention of giving Luo Wen the luxury of time. Early the next morning, just as dawn broke, their densely packed forces crossed the border, advancing on the swarm's base. Despite the abrupt timing, Luo Wen remained unfazed. He had long prepared for this decisive battle. The only difference was that the longer the delay, the fewer casualties his swarm would suffer. Having absorbed countless pieces of intelligence, Luo Wen's unparalleled intellect allowed him to craft an elaborate trap. The enemy's rapid discovery of the swarm's base was no coincidence, it was all part of Luo Wen's plan. Rather than fight on an uncontrollable battlefield, Luo Wen had deliberately prepared a stage for the enemy, ensuring the confrontation would play out on his terms. With the scout bug's superior vision, every movement of the enemy army was under Luo Wen's watchful eye. As the enemy forces advanced, small swarm detachments continuously appeared in their path, strategically retreating to lure them closer to the base. The stage was already set. Now, the actors just needed to enter. The bait squads gradually returned, retreating into the base's tunnels. The Red and Black Ant Coalition arrived shortly after, their sheer numbers staining the ground in a tapestry of red and black. When they reached the swarm's base, they found the surface eerily clean. There were no signs of life, only a dark, funnel-shaped hole gaping like an ominous eye in the earth. Faced with this abyss-like entrance, the coalition hesitated not a moment. The nimble and aggressive red ants led the charge, diving headfirst into the tunnel. Once inside, they encountered a long passageway. Crawling through it, they entered a massive chamber. Here, they were met with a brutal ambush. Dozens of giant mandible soldier ants were stationed around the tunnel entrance. The moment a red ant poked its head out, it was grabbed and flung back into the chamber, where swarms of small soldier ants swarmed over it to finish the kill. While this bottleneck tactic was insufficient to eliminate an army of 500,000, it effectively stalled them. The giant mandible soldier ants rotated in shifts. Once a group exhausted their strength, they withdrew, replaced by fresh reinforcements. The red ants at the front were picked off one by one, while those at the rear, unaware of the situation, continued to surge forward. Occasionally, a group would burst through the defenses or be pushed forward by the press of their comrades, only to face overwhelming numbers in the chamber beyond, where they were swiftly overwhelmed. Though the passage was relatively wide, it was still too narrow for the sheer size of the enemy army. Only a small fraction could enter at a time. After losing over 10,000 troops in half a day, the rear forces began to grow restless. Smaller groups broke away from the main force to forage in the surrounding area. Unbeknownst to them, their movements were closely monitored by the scout bugs. As soon as they strayed from the main force, they were met by the swarm's mobile units, who had been sharpening their claws in anticipation. C-59. Attrition. The swarm deployed its units in small groups of a few hundred, each consisting of scout bugs, soldier ants, small soldier ants, and worker ants. Every squad was accompanied by a transport bug, tasked with patrolling around the enemy forces to intercept and annihilate their foraging teams. A foraging team of approximately 500 ants had ventured less than 50 meters from their main force when they were intercepted by two mobile swarm squads. 500 versus 1,000, and with the smaller group possessing inferior individual combat power, the outcome was a foregone conclusion. Each red ant had to face at least two worker ants. Although the worker ants relied on superior numbers and size, their primary tactic was to engage in prolonged skirmishes. The red ants' stinger attacks were indeed formidable, capable of defeating targets significantly larger than themselves. However, stinger strikes had a critical weakness. To target an armored opponent, the red ants needed to climb onto the enemy, secure themselves, and find vulnerable spots like armor joints to pierce with their stingers. The worker ants countered this by remaining highly mobile. Every time a red ant curled its abdomen in preparation for a stinger attack, the worker ants would dodge out of reach. Even if a red ant managed to grab hold of one, nearby worker ants would promptly intervene, pulling the red ant away. Despite the effectiveness of these tactics, unexpected events still occurred. Some worker ants were caught and stung during the battle. Nevertheless, the red ant coalition fell faster than the swarm sustained losses. Combining the efforts of the soldier ants and small soldier ants, the swarm prioritized eliminating the weaker black ants. The black ants, with their inferior combat abilities and lack of the worker ants' agility, were swiftly eradicated under the soldier ants' onslaught. Once the weaker opponents were dealt with, the soldier ants surrounded the red ants still entangled with the worker ants. The red ants, which had barely held their ground moments ago, began to fall rapidly. Their defeat snowballed, and in the end, only about 50 red ants managed to break through and flee back toward their main force in panic. The previously idle transport bugs now sprang into action, chasing down the fleeing red ants. Along the way, they eliminated over a dozen more before turning back, stopping about 20 meters from the enemy's main force. With their long legs and superior speed, the transport bugs retreated effortlessly. During the skirmish, the swarm lost 2 small soldier ants and over a dozen worker ants. Their bodies, along with those of the enemy, were quickly loaded onto the backs of the transport bugs. The squads then retreated to a hidden location, where they uncovered a passage concealed by a leaf. The worker ants carried their spoils into the tunnel and delved deeper into the earth. This tunnel was one of the concealed entrances to a branch base. Luo Wen, ever cautious, had constructed over a dozen escape routes even when he was operating alone. Now, with a decisive battle underway, there was no way he would rely on just one entrance and exit. The tunnel used for the enemy's invasion was deliberately designed as a trap to lure them in. Similarly, the plan to flood the coalition's brood nest had been formulated after Luo Wen observed that their nest had only one entrance, the so-called volcano mouth. The devastation he witnessed at the nest further reinforced his belief in the importance of having multiple escape routes. After a short while, the worker ants emerged from the hidden tunnel, climbed onto waiting transport bugs, and swiftly departed. Once they left, several spy bugs crawled out of the tunnel, erasing pheromone traces left behind. They then resealed the entrance. In addition to the spy bugs, numerous burrower ants were stationed inside the tunnel. Their task was to collapse the passage and bury it should the enemy discover it, ensuring the safety of their allies within. Elsewhere on the battlefield, a mobile swarm squad was leading a 2,000-strong coalition force on a wild chase. Just ahead, 10 more mobile squads lay in ambush, waiting for the coalition forces to arrive. 2,000 versus 5,500, the result was inevitable. The only question was how many of the coalition forces would survive to retreat. Thanks to their superior mobility and visual range, the swarm's mobile squads maintained the advantage of fighting outnumbered enemies, steadily whittling down the coalition's numbers. Faced with constant harassment and the continued loss of their foraging teams, the coalition's main force finally grew restless. They began regrouping to sweep the surrounding areas. Luo Wen quickly detected their movements and issued orders for the swarm blocking the tunnel entrance to retreat, leaving the passage open. Immediately, the coalition forces trapped in the tunnel surged forward, pouring into the massive underground chamber. As their numbers grew, worker ants hidden along the chamber walls and ceiling assumed their acid spray formation. Acid rained down like a torrential storm, drenching the unprepared coalition forces. The attack was devastating. Those fortunate enough only lost their antennae, while the less lucky had their exoskeletons corroded, dying instantly. After the acid downpour, the giant mandible soldier ants resumed their positions, sealing the passage once again. With much of the coalition force cleared from the tunnel, the soldier ants now found themselves with a rare moment of respite. The small soldier ants and worker ants charged into the chamber, finishing off any survivors and carrying their bodies deeper into the nest. Initially intending to eliminate the swarm's harassing squads, the coalition hesitated when they found the tunnel unexpectedly cleared. Torn between attacking the nest and continuing their sweep, they eventually chose to press forward into the tunnel. Once again, waves of coalition forces flooded into the passage, only to face renewed acid attacks and countermeasures from the swarm. Whenever the coalition forces grew impatient and prepared to withdraw, Luo Wen would order the tunnel to be reopened, allowing more of them inside, just in time for another acid barrage. Fortunately for Luo Wen, the red and black ants lacked complex strategic thinking. They fell for this simple tactic repeatedly over 2 full days. During this time, the underground nest became a graveyard for over 100,000 enemy soldiers. Meanwhile, the swarm's mobile units annihilated at least another 50,000 coalition troops. However, the swarm itself lost more than 10,000 of its own. The swarm converted the fallen into protein reserves, temporarily achieving self-sufficiency through sustenance via combat at the forward base. Instead of transporting food to the forward base, the transport bugs now redirected supplies to nearby hive bases, where 50 queen ants worked tirelessly to produce small soldier ants. Additionally, the 100 other hive bases across the territory were no less busy. While their genetic libraries couldn't be updated, they focused entirely on producing worker ants and giant mandible soldier ants. The reinforcements were then transported by transport bugs to the vicinity of the front lines. C60. Consumption. Despite losing over 100,000 troops in the past 2 days, the Red and Black Ant Coalition continued to receive reinforcements from their rear territory, keeping their total numbers above 500,000. Meanwhile, Luo Wen's swarm steadily bolstered its ranks with new arrivals from the territory. The total swarm force had grown to nearly 300,000. The gap in troop strength between the two sides was gradually narrowing. Finally, the coalition realized they could no longer allow Luo Wen to continue his attritional tactics. Gathering their forces, they ignored the emptied underground tunnels and the persistent harassment by swarm squads, marching en masse past the underground base and deeper into swarm territory. Perched on the trunk of a plant along their path, Luo Wen estimated the coalition's composition. The ratio of red ants to black ants was now about 1:9. Most of the red ants, having spearheaded earlier assaults, had been severely depleted during the battles at the underground base. Although the coalition still numbered over 500,000, their overall combat effectiveness had significantly diminished. In the central ranks of the coalition, Luo Wen spotted several massive red ants. These ants were dozens of times the size of ordinary red ants, with distinctive, swollen abdomens that marked them as queen ants of the red ant species. These queens had not been present during Luo Wen's earlier reconnaissance. Clearly, they had arrived with reinforcements from the rear. What surprised Luo Wen even more was that these queens coexisted peacefully, suggesting that red ants might be a multi-queen species. Their whole family migration strategy gave Luo Wen an oddly familiar sense of déjà vu. After a moment of thought, it struck him, this was the swarm's own classic strategy, the move the entire hive tactic. To think these red ants, with their limited intelligence, could conceive such a strategy amused Luo Wen. However, their execution was flawed. The essence of this tactic was to fortify one's own base to stall the enemy's main force, while using the rest of the army to capture the enemy's headquarters. Instead, the coalition was attempting to forcibly migrate while the swarm army was right beside them. It was suicidal. Emerging from their underground base, the concealed swarm surged out to engage the coalition's rear guard. The two armies clashed like tidal waves. Transport bugs, carrying worker ants, spearheaded the assault, unleashing a round of ranged attacks to incapacitate portions of the enemy force and sow chaos before quickly withdrawing. The predominantly black ant coalition, lacking stingers, had no effective counter to the swift, hit-and-run tactics of the long-legged transport bugs. Even when a black ant managed to latch onto a transport bug's limb, nearby transport bugs would swiftly kill it. The acid spray attacks, though less effective in open environments than in the confined underground tunnels, still served to disorient and scatter the enemy. Many ants with corroded antennae turned into aimless wanderers, creating disorder within the coalition's rear ranks. In no time, tens of thousands of their troops were thrown into chaos, disconnected from their vanguard. Seizing the opportunity, the pursuing swarm accelerated their assault, engaging the disorganized coalition in fierce melee combat on open ground. Although individual black ants were weak, the sheer scale of a melee involving tens of thousands of troops made differences in individual strength less significant. Even Luo Wen, with his superior combat ability, could be overwhelmed if surrounded by the enemy. He was always reminded of the grim fate of the spider he once encountered. In the chaos, a red ant managed to grapple a worker ant and drive its stinger into the worker ant's abdomen, only to be impaled moments later by a passing transport bug. Both combatants perished in the skirmish, locked together in death. Elsewhere, a giant mandible soldier ant, having advanced too far, was surrounded by dozens of black ants. Some tore at its limbs, while others targeted its joints. By the time reinforcements arrived, the soldier ant had only 2 legs remaining. Though rescued, it could no longer move and would be processed for protein recovery. The battlefield was a scene of relentless carnage, with hundreds or thousands of ants perishing every moment. Words failed to capture the ferocity of the combat. Without the advantage of terrain, the swarm suffered heavier losses in direct engagements, even with their superior strength. However, as more swarm mobile units arrived, the coalition forces, which had initially held their own, began to falter. The coalition's reliance on pheromones for communication proved inefficient. By the time news of their rear guard's plight reached their command and decisions were relayed back, the swarm had already obliterated the rear forces, looted their remains, and retreated. Frustrated, the coalition launched a full-scale pursuit. Yet the trail left by the swarm indicated that their forces had split into several retreating groups. Lacking strategic knowledge, the coalition impulsively divided their army to chase after the swarm. Following the pheromone trails led them to further branching paths, where they divided again. These misleading pheromones, left by spy bugs under Luo Wen's orders, were intended to slow the coalition's pursuit. Luo Wen hadn't expected the coalition to divide so readily, but he wasn't about to let the opportunity go to waste. He ordered spy bugs to create more branching trails. Meanwhile, the swarm regrouped and consumed part of their spoils to replenish their strength. After a brief regrouping, Luo Wen mobilized approximately 150,000 troops, though another 100,000 swarm forces were scattered across the area. While Luo Wen had dispatched messengers to locate these mobile units, he hoped they would avoid blundering into the coalition's main force. After repeated splits, the coalition's forces were fragmented. Aside from the main force guarding the queens, which still numbered over 200,000, the remaining units were reduced to smaller groups of 20,000 to 30,000 each. Luo Wen lured one such 20,000-strong detachment away from the main army, ambushing it with a 150,000-strong swarm contingent riding on transport bugs. The smaller force was completely surrounded, with not a single ant escaping. The disparity in numbers and individual combat power rendered the battle one-sided. The smaller coalition force was annihilated with minimal swarm losses. Luo Wen then led his forces in a circuit around the coalition, repeatedly baiting and eliminating isolated detachments. Though the tactics were simple, they proved consistently effective. Luo Wen couldn't help but feel a sense of detachment. As an ordinary human employing military strategy against insects, he felt as if he were bullying them with his superior intellect.